Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories. Tonight we're going to settle into a story that unfolds slowly, without urgency, without spectacle, and without the need to arrive anywhere too quickly. This is a subject that has often been framed in dramatic terms, filled with declarations, warnings, and conclusions drawn far too early. Here, it will be approached differently, gently, patiently, with the understanding that some ideas were never meant to be delivered all at once, and some meanings only reveal themselves when allowed to breathe. The Anunnaki have become one of the most discussed and misunderstood groups of beings in ancient history. They are often presented as engineers, conquerors, or visitors with a singular goal, but the original texts never describe them with such simplicity. When the tablets are read carefully, when they are allowed to speak without modern expectations layered on top of them, a quieter pattern begins to emerge. Not one of domination or revelation, but of preparation. Not preparation in the sense of instruction manuals or spoken warnings, but preparation through structure, repetition, limitation, and time. This story does not begin with humanity standing at the center of cosmic attention. It begins with systems, with order, with boundaries being placed gently but firmly around what could exist and how it could function. The earlier Sumerian texts are not concerned with explaining everything. They are concerned with stabilizing things. They describe a world that must be maintained, not conquered, sustained, not accelerated. In that world, humanity is not treated as an endpoint, but as a component, something that must be shaped gradually to fit into a larger arrangement. Preparation, in the Sumerian sense, is never announced. There are no speeches declaring what humanity will become. There are no timelines laid out for a final outcome. Instead, the texts describe repeated adjustments. Roles are assigned, limits are enforced. Knowledge is distributed unevenly. Time itself is structured into cycles that repeat often enough to teach patterns without ever explaining them directly. From the beginning, the Anunnaki are associated with regulation rather than creation. They do not appear at the moment when the cosmos comes into being. They arrive after systems already exist. Heaven and earth have been separated. The waters have been assigned their places. The air moves between realms. Humanity has already been shaped from clay and breath. Only then do the Anunnaki take their positions, not as architects but as overseers of fate, judges of outcome, and maintainers of balance within an already functioning world. This distinction matters. It changes how their role must be understood. If they were preparing humanity, they were not preparing it for a single event, a sudden arrival, or an external invasion. They were preparing it to exist within constraints, to function under pressure, to endure cycles of growth and loss without collapsing entirely. The texts return to this theme again and again, often indirectly. Cities rise and fall, kings rule and disappear. Floods erase worlds that seemed permanent. And yet something continues, not unchanged, but adjusted. Preparation described in these texts is subtle. It does not feel like guidance in the modern sense. It feels more like conditioning. Humanity is placed into an environment where survival depends on learning patterns, respecting limits, and adapting to forces that cannot be controlled. Agriculture requires patience and timing. Writing requires discipline and memory. Law requires restraint. Kingship requires responsibility and accountability, even when authority is framed as divine. The Anunnaki appear most clearly at moments when consequences are being assigned. They are present when fates are fixed, when boundaries are enforced, when the outcome of actions must be recorded rather than reversed. This suggests a role focused on continuity rather than intervention. They do not rush to save, they do not rush to destroy. They observe, evaluate, and allow processes to run their course, stepping in only when balance must be restored. What humanity is being prepared for is never stated outright in the texts, but the conditions of that preparation are everywhere. Lifespans are shortened. Knowledge is restricted. Access to divine presence becomes limited. Communication between realms grows indirect. These are not signs of abandonment. They are signs of transition, a gradual movement away from dependency and toward autonomy, though autonomy within strict limits rather than freedom without consequence. Even catastrophe, when it appears, functions as a corrective rather than a conclusion. The flood does not erase humanity completely. It reduces it. It compresses it. It forces a restart under new conditions. Afterward, the rules change. Lifespans are reduced. Population growth is controlled. The world becomes harsher, but also more stable. These are not the actions of beings seeking worship or obedience. They are the actions of administrators ensuring that a system remains sustainable. Throughout the texts, humanity is never told what it is being prepared for. There are no prophecies outlining a final test or an ultimate goal. Instead, preparation happens through lived experience, through repetition, through memory, through loss and rebuilding. Writing itself becomes one of the most important tools in this process, not because it reveals hidden truths, but because it preserves patterns. It allows humanity to remember what worked, what failed, and what must not be repeated blindly. The Anunnaki's association with the underworld reinforces this interpretation. They are connected to endings, to judgment, to the final accounting of actions. This does not mean they are figures of punishment. It means they are figures of closure. They ensure that actions lead somewhere. That choices have weight. That existence is not random, even when it feels indifferent. Preparation, in this context, is not about readiness for arrival or return. It is about readiness for continuity, for existing in a world where divine presence recedes, where humanity must operate with incomplete knowledge, and where meaning must be constructed rather than received. The gods do not disappear entirely, but they become distant. Ritual replaces conversation. Memory replaces instruction. Law replaces command. This is not framed as a tragedy in the texts. It is presented as a necessary development. A world where gods walk openly among humans cannot remain stable indefinitely. Boundaries must harden. Distance must increase. Responsibility must shift. Humanity must learn to carry more of the burden of existence on its own, even while acknowledging forces beyond its control. Nothing in the Sumerian record suggests that this preparation has a clean endpoint. It unfolds over generations, it pauses, it resumes, it adapts. Even the Anunnaki themselves do not appear as eternal constants. Their roles are specific, their authority contextual, their presence tied to particular phases of cosmic administration. As this story continues, it will move carefully through these patterns, not to reach a conclusion, but to trace a process, to follow how preparation can occur without instruction, how systems can teach without explaining, and how humanity can be shaped not by revelation, but by constraint. The ground has been set. The pace remains unhurried. What follows builds from this foundation, carrying the same quiet logic forward without breaking the flow. The world the Sumerian texts describe is never static. It does not wait for humanity to arrive in order to begin functioning, and it does not pause to explain itself once humans appear within it. From the very beginning of the written record, existence is already underway, already structured, already governed by forces that move independently of human awareness. This matters deeply when trying to understand what preparation might mean in this context, because preparation cannot begin from stillness. It only makes sense in a world that is already moving, already operating according to rules that predate those who must eventually learn to live within them. In the oldest layers of Sumerian thought, there is no moment where the cosmos sits unfinished, waiting for instruction. Even the primordial state described in the texts is not chaos in the modern sense. It is undifferentiated, but not inactive. The waters exist. Potential exists. Motion exists, even if direction does not yet. Creation is not a sudden act imposed upon nothingness, but a gradual clarification of what was already present in latent form. By the time humanity enters the picture, the process has been unfolding for an immeasurable span of time. This framing immediately shifts the role humanity occupies. Humans are not introduced as the reason the system exists. They are introduced as something that must adapt to a system already in motion. The rivers flow before cities rise. The stars move before calendars are written. The seasons turn before agriculture is mastered. The world is already doing what it does, indifferent to whether humans understand it or not. In this kind of world, preparation does not involve teaching rules explicitly. It involves exposure, repetition, constraint. Humanity is placed into a moving structure and must learn to adjust itself in response. This is not mentorship, it is conditioning. The texts never suggest that humans were expected to comprehend the full structure of existence. They suggest that humans were expected to endure within it. The Anunnaki appear within this already active world, not as initiators of motion, but as regulators of consequence. They are associated with judgment, fate, and finality, not with beginnings. This is consistent across texts. They do not separate heaven and earth. They do not establish the waters. They do not invent humanity. They arrive after these things are already in place, when the system requires oversight rather than creation. That distinction is subtle but crucial. Oversight only becomes necessary once processes are running. You do not regulate something that has not yet begun. You regulate something that must be kept within bounds. The presence of the Anunnaki implies a world that has reached a level of complexity, where outcomes matter, where imbalance can propagate, where actions ripple beyond their immediate context. Humanity enters this world mid-motion. There is no orientation period, no pause. Humans are created to work, to maintain, to participate in the functioning of a system they did not design and will never fully control. Agriculture binds them to cycles they cannot alter. Writing binds them to memory they cannot escape. Law binds them to decisions whose consequences persist long after individuals are gone. From the earliest cities, this sense of inherited motion is everywhere. Cities are not founded arbitrarily. They are placed where water already flows, where soil already accumulates, where trade routes already exist in embryonic form. Civilization does not impose itself upon nature in these texts. It inserts itself into existing currents and learns to ride them. Even kingship reflects this principle. Kings do not invent authority. Authority descends already formed. The king becomes a node within a system, not its origin. His role is to maintain order, not redefine it. When he fails, the system does not collapse. Another king takes his place. The motion continues. This understanding of the world as perpetually active shapes how preparation unfolds. Preparation is not about readiness for novelty. It is about resilience within continuity. Humanity is being conditioned to function under conditions that do not change to accommodate it. Floods come whether cities are prepared or not. Droughts arrive without regard for political stability. Disease spreads without consulting moral frameworks. The texts do not portray these events as punishments in every case. Often, they are described simply as occurrences within a system that has limits. When those limits are exceeded, correction follows. Noise becomes too great. Population becomes too dense. Resources become strained. The system responds. The Anunnaki appear at precisely these moments, not as instigators, but as arbiters. They determine outcomes rather than causes. They sit in judgment when processes reach their conclusions. This suggests that humanity is being prepared not to avoid consequences, but to live with them. Living in a world already in motion means accepting that not everything can be explained in advance. The Sumerian texts reflect this by withholding explanations rather than offering them. Events happen. Only later are meanings assigned, if at all. Humanity learns after the fact. Memory replaces foresight. This is where writing becomes essential. Writing does not stop the world from moving. It allows humanity to track movement, to notice patterns, to preserve lessons learned too late to prevent disaster, but early enough to influence future response. Writing is not presented as a gift of enlightenment. It is presented as a tool for continuity. The Anunnaki's relationship to fate reinforces this. Fate in these texts is not destiny in the modern sense of a fixed, scripted outcome. It is the assignment of consequences once actions have occurred. Fate is recorded, not predicted. This makes it compatible with a world in motion, where outcomes emerge from interaction rather than decree. Humanity, in this framework, is being prepared to exist without guarantees. The gods do not promise stability. They do not promise protection. They promise order, which is not the same thing. Order allows a system to persist even when individual components fail. Cities can fall without ending civilization. Kings can die without ending kingship. Generations can pass without ending humanity. This kind of preparation produces a very specific kind of endurance. It does not create optimism. It creates realism. Humans learn that survival depends on adaptation, not favour. On timing, not control. On memory, not prophecy. The texts consistently avoid presenting the world as centered on human experience. Humans are important because they perform necessary functions, not because they are the focus of existence. This is not dehumanizing, it is stabilizing. A system that does not revolve around humanity can persist even when humanity falters. The Anunnaki operate comfortably within this framework. They do not argue for human exceptionalism. They do not frame humanity as sacred above all else. They treat humanity as a component whose behaviour must remain within acceptable bounds. When it does, the system holds. When it does not, correction occurs. Preparation, then, is not preparation for salvation or transformation. It is preparation for continued participation. Humanity is shaped to withstand repetition, to recover from loss, to rebuild without assuming permanence, to live knowing that nothing remains unchanged indefinitely. This understanding explains why the texts never pause to announce what humanity is being prepared for. There is no singular destination. The world does not stop moving to accommodate milestones. Preparation is ongoing because motion is ongoing. The system does not end, it adjusts. As the story moves forward, this sense of inherited motion will remain central. The Anunnaki do not interrupt it. They reinforce it. They ensure that movement does not become chaos, that continuity does not dissolve into collapse. Humanity is learning, slowly and unevenly, to move within this structure without being destroyed by it. Nothing here is resolved. Nothing concludes. The world continues to turn, indifferent to whether its patterns are fully understood. And within that movement, the process of preparation continues quiet and unannounced, shaping humanity through the simple fact of having to exist in a world that never stops. The earlier Sumerian texts are careful in how they introduce the Anunnaki, and what they choose not to say is just as important as what they record. When these beings first appear in the written tradition, they are not framed as instructors, guides, or benefactors in the way later cultures often imagine divine figures. They do not arrive bearing lessons. They do not gather humanity to explain the structure of the world. They do not offer moral frameworks or technical instruction. This absence is not accidental. It reflects a deeper logic embedded in the Sumerian understanding of how order is established and maintained. In the oldest layers of the tablets, teaching is not the primary method by which systems are stabilized. Structure comes first. Function comes first. Explanation comes later, if it comes at all. The Anunnaki emerge within a world that already has mechanisms for learning that do not rely on instruction. Experience precedes understanding. Repetition precedes theory. Constraint precedes insight. In such a world, teachers are unnecessary at the beginning because nothing is yet stable enough to explain. The texts show that when the Anunnaki are introduced, humanity already exists and is already performing its assigned roles. Humans are digging canals, maintaining fields, building structures and supporting the temples. This labour is not framed as education, it is framed as participation. Humans learn by doing, by repeating tasks that align them with the rhythms of the world around them. Agriculture teaches timing without explanation. Construction teaches limitation without commentary. Labour teaches endurance without philosophy. In this context, a teacher would be redundant. The system itself teaches through consequence. Plant too early and the crop fails. Ignore maintenance and the canal collapses. Overpopulate and resources strain. The world responds immediately and consistently. The Anunnaki do not need to explain these outcomes. They exist to ensure that outcomes are assigned, not to prevent them. The earliest portrayals of the Anunnaki emphasize their role as determiners of fate and judges of result. They appear when decisions must be fixed rather than debated. Their presence marks the moment when ambiguity ends. This is not the role of a teacher. A teacher allows for revision, for questioning, for gradual comprehension. The Anunnaki appear when action has already occurred, and consequence must follow. This framing suggests that humanity was not meant to be guided gently at first. It was meant to be tested against reality. The texts reflect a belief that knowledge gained without pressure is fragile. Knowledge gained through survival is durable. By withholding instruction, the system ensures that whatever humanity learns is anchored in necessity rather than abstraction. The absence of teaching also reinforces hierarchy. The gods who do teach appear earlier and in different contexts. Enki, for example, is associated with ingenuity, craft, and problem-solving. When instruction appears in the text, it comes through figures like him, not through the Anunnaki. Even then, instruction is limited and often indirect. Knowledge is shared selectively, framed as gifts rather than rights. The Anunnaki's silence at the beginning signals their distance from the processes of growth and experimentation. They are not involved in trial and error. They are involved in assessment. This separation matters. It means humanity is allowed to develop imperfectly, to fail repeatedly, to adjust through loss rather than correction. Teaching too early would interfere with this process. The Sumerian worldview does not value efficiency in the modern sense. It values stability over speed. A slow learning curve is not a flaw, it is a safeguard. If humanity were taught everything at once, it would become dependent on instruction, rather than capable of adaptation. The text suggests that such dependency would weaken the system rather than strengthen it. The lack of teachers also preserves mystery. Not everything is meant to be understood immediately. Some knowledge carries weight that can only be borne after experience. By delaying explanation, the system ensures that meaning arrives when it can be sustained rather than when it is merely desired. When teaching does appear later in the tradition, it is often framed as response rather than initiative. Knowledge is given to address specific imbalances, not to satisfy curiosity. Agriculture is refined when scarcity threatens. Writing emerges when memory becomes insufficient. Law is codified when conflict grows unmanageable. Instruction follows necessity, not aspiration. The Anunnaki's role remains consistent throughout these developments. They do not deliver the knowledge, they measure its impact. They assess whether humanity's use of new tools remains within acceptable limits. If imbalance grows, they do not explain to weigh. They allow correction to occur. This approach produces a particular kind of intelligence. Humanity learns to anticipate outcomes rather than rely on instruction. Pattern recognition becomes more valuable than doctrine. Memory becomes more important than revelation. Survival depends on reading the world rather than listening for commands. The texts also avoid portraying the Anunnaki as moral authorities at first. They do not instruct humanity on right and wrong. They judge outcomes, not intentions. This reinforces a worldview where morality is embedded in consequence rather than declared in advance. Actions reveal their value through effect, not through alignment with abstract principles. This absence of early teaching also explains why later generations struggled to interpret the actions of the gods. Without explicit instruction, meaning had to be inferred. Ritual developed as a way to negotiate uncertainty. Law developed as a way to reduce unpredictability. Writing developed as a way to preserve interpretations that seem to work. The Anunnaki remain distant through all of this. Their authority does not diminish, but it does not expand into instruction either. They do not correct misunderstandings directly. They allow interpretations to rise and fall based on their effectiveness. Those that align with stability persist. Those that do not fade. This is not indifference. It is restraint. A system that intervenes too early prevents adaptation. A system that teaches too clearly eliminates resilience. The Sumerian texts suggest an understanding that growth requires friction, and that clarity delivered too soon can weaken rather than strengthen. By not presenting the Anunnaki as teachers at first, the texts preserve humanity's role as an adaptive participant rather than a guided project. Humans are not students waiting for lessons. They are agents learning through consequence. This distinction shapes everything that follows. As humanity develops more complex social structures, the need for instruction grows, but even then it is fragmented and conditional. Knowledge is never centralized. It is distributed across roles, professions, and rituals. No single group holds complete understanding. This fragmentation prevents collapse if any one part fails. The Anunnaki remain at the edge of this system. They do not fill gaps. They do not resolve confusion. They ensure continuity by allowing the system to correct itself. When intervention occurs, it is structural rather than instructional. Floods reset populations. Limits are imposed on lifespans. Fertility is regulated. These are not lessons. They are adjustments. This approach to preparation produces a humanity capable of enduring uncertainty, not because it understands everything, but because it has learned to function without full understanding. The absence of early teaching is not a failure of compassion. It is a deliberate shaping of resilience. Nothing in the text suggests that this phase ever fully ends. Even later, when instruction becomes more visible, it remains partial. Humanity is never told everything. There is always distance, always silence, always gaps in explanation. These gaps are not oversights. They are features of a system designed to continue without constant oversight. The Anunnaki do not teach at first because teaching is not the foundation of this world. Endurance is, stability is, continuity is. Teaching becomes necessary only once those foundations can support it. Until then, humanity is left to learn the only way a moving system allows, by living within it and absorbing its patterns through repetition, loss, and adaptation. As the narrative continues, this absence will become increasingly significant. It will shape how later knowledge is given, why it is limited, and why preparation unfolds without announcement or clarity. The silence at the beginning is not emptiness. It is the space in which a particular kind of humanity is being formed, one capable of persisting without instruction in a world that never stops moving. The oldest Sumerian tablets do not explain themselves. They do not pause to justify their claims, and they do not provide commentary meant to guide the reader toward a single interpretation. They record actions, outcomes, sequences, and limits, often without clarifying intent. This is not a failure of communication. It is a reflection of how preparation is understood within the worldview that produced these texts. Preparation does not require explanation. In many cases, explanation would interfere with its effectiveness. When these tablets were first inscribed, writing itself was a new and fragile technology. It was not designed to persuade or instruct in the modern sense. It was designed to preserve, to fix something in place so that it would not be lost. What the scribes chose to preserve reveals what mattered most. They recorded boundaries, genealogies, assignments of role, distributions of power, lists of cities, lists of kings, lists of gods. These are not narratives meant to inspire understanding. They are frameworks meant to endure. The absence of explanation is especially striking when compared to later traditions. Later myths elaborate motives. They dramatize conflict. They offer speeches and dialogues that clarify intent. The earlier Sumerian material does not do this. It assumes that the reader or listener already inhabits the world being described, already understands its pressures, already knows what it feels like to live under constraint. Explanation would be redundant because life itself supplies the context. Preparation in this environment takes the form of placement. Humanity is placed into a world that behaves consistently, even when that behavior is harsh. Rivers flood, fields dry out, storms destroy. Time advances without regard for desire. These are not explained as lessons. They are simply facts of existence. The tablets mirror this approach. They state what happens, not why it happens in a moral or instructional sense. The gods themselves are treated similarly. Their actions are recorded, but their reasoning is often left unstated. When a decree is issued, it is not debated in detail. When a punishment occurs, it is not justified at length. The focus remains on consequence rather than rationale. This suggests a world view in which understanding is secondary to alignment. One does not need to understand the system to function within it. One needs to respect its limits. This has direct implications for how preparation unfolds. Humanity is not being trained to comprehend the cosmos in its entirety. Humanity is being conditioned to survive within it. Survival does not require full explanation. It requires responsiveness, the ability to notice patterns, the capacity to adjust behavior based on outcome. The tablets reinforce this through repetition rather than exposition. Similar structures appear again and again. Cities are founded and destroyed. Kings rise and fall. Divine favor shifts. Each instance reinforces the same underlying lesson without stating it outright. Permanence is an illusion. Continuity depends on adaptability. Even the creation of humanity is framed without explanation of ultimate purpose. Humans are created to relieve the gods of labor. That is stated plainly. But what that labor ultimately serves is not expanded upon. The system does not justify itself. It simply operates. Humans are drawn into that operation without being told what the final goal might be. This is preparation without orientation. Humanity is not shown a destination. It is shown a process. Participation itself becomes the means of learning. Over time, this produces a population that understands limitation intuitively rather than intellectually. People learn when to plant because failure teaches them. They learn when to harvest because hunger corrects them. They learn where to build because floods erase mistakes. The Anunnaki fit neatly into this pattern. They appear in contexts where outcomes must be fixed, not explained. They are associated with judgment, with the recording of fate, with the final state of things after action has already occurred. They do not intervene early to prevent error. They intervene late to stabilize consequence. This reinforces the idea that explanation is not the primary tool of preparation. The silence of the tablets on certain matters is deliberate. They do not describe the Anunnaki arriving to teach humanity how to live. They do not describe a curriculum of knowledge being imparted. Instead, they describe a world where knowledge emerges unevenly, often too late to prevent suffering, but early enough to prevent repetition. This is not benevolent guidance. It is structural conditioning. The lack of explanation also prevents dependency. A population that relies on instruction becomes vulnerable when instruction is withdrawn. A population that learns through consequence retains knowledge even when authority recedes. The Sumerian world anticipates distance. Divine presence becomes less immediate over time. Direct communication fades. Ritual replaces conversation. Memory replaces instruction. By withholding explanation, the system ensures that humanity develops internal reference points rather than external reliance. Customs form, traditions solidify. Laws emerge not as divine pronouncements, but as responses to accumulated experience. Writing preserves not revelation, but record. This record becomes the basis for future decision-making. The oldest tablets also resist narrative closure. They do not conclude arcs cleanly. They do not resolve tension definitively. This mirrors a world where preparation is ongoing rather than finite. If humanity were being prepared for a single event, explanation would be necessary. A warning would be issued. Instructions would be given. None of this appears. Instead, preparation seems oriented toward endurance across indefinite time, toward surviving repeated disruptions, toward maintaining identity despite transformation. Explanation would freeze understanding at a particular moment. Silence allows adaptation. The tablet's focus on lists and structures reinforces this. Lists do not explain. They enumerate. They establish order without commentary. A list of kings does not justify kingship, it assumes it. A list of gods does not explain divinity, it records it. These lists train the mind to accept hierarchy and sequence as given. This acceptance is itself a form of preparation. Humanity becomes accustomed to operating within frameworks it did not choose. Authority exists prior to consent. Time advances without negotiation. Death arrives without explanation. These conditions shape behavior more effectively than instruction ever could. The Anunnaki, as figures tied to fate, reinforce this conditioning. Fate in the Sumerian sense is not prophecy. It is assignment, a fixing of outcome after action. It does not tell one what will happen in advance. It tells one what has been decided after the fact. This keeps humanity oriented toward caution rather than expectation. Even when catastrophe strikes, explanation remains minimal. The flood is decreed, the flood happens, survivors respond. Only later do fragments of reasoning emerge, and even then they are incomplete. Noise disturbed the gods. Population grew too large. These explanations are functional, not moral. They do not provide guidance for preventing future catastrophe. They describe thresholds that, once crossed, trigger correction. This reinforces a critical aspect of preparation. Humanity is not being prepared to avoid disaster entirely. It is being prepared to rebuild after disaster. The texts spend far more time describing what happens after destruction than explaining why destruction occurred. Survival becomes the focus. Continuity becomes the priority. The absence of explanation also protects the system from misuse. Knowledge without context can be weaponized. Explanation invites interpretation, and interpretation invites manipulation. By limiting explanation, the system limits the ability of any one group to claim complete understanding. Authority remains distributed. Meaning remains contested. This is visible in the diversity of interpretations that arise even within Sumerian culture itself. Different cities emphasize different gods. Different traditions preserve different versions of the same story. No single narrative dominates completely. This fragmentation prevents rigidity. Preparation without explanation produces a culture comfortable with ambiguity. Not because ambiguity is celebrated, but because it is unavoidable. Life unfolds without full clarity. Decisions must be made without complete information. Responsibility remains, even when understanding is partial. The oldest tablets reflect this reality rather than attempting to resolve it. They do not promise answers. They preserve patterns. They record what persisted long enough to matter. In doing so, they function less as teaching tools and more as stabilizing anchors within a moving world. The Anunnaki do not disrupt this approach. They embody it. They stand at the point where uncertainty ends and consequence begins. They do not explain the system. They enforce it. This enforcement is quiet, procedural, and consistent. Preparation, then, is not about readiness for revelation. It is about capacity to endure without it. Humanity is shaped to live with incomplete knowledge, to function under pressure, to accept correction without understanding its full cause. This is not accidental. It is the product of a system designed to continue long after direct oversight fades. As the narrative moves forward, this absence of explanation will continue to shape every development. Knowledge will be given sparingly. Authority will recede gradually. Humanity will be left to operate within frameworks that were established long before it understood them. Preparation will continue, not through instruction, but through exposure to a world that demands adaptation simply by continuing to exist. The Sumerian texts make a clear distinction between bringing humanity into existence and forming humanity into something capable of enduring. These two processes are not treated as the same act, nor are they given equal weight in the narrative record. Creation is described briefly, almost economically. Shaping unfolds slowly, repeatedly, and across generations. This difference is essential for understanding what preparation might mean in the context of the Anunnaki and the world they oversaw. Humanity's creation is presented as a response to a problem. The gods required labour. Maintenance was exhausting. Order demanded constant effort. Humans were fashioned to relieve that burden. The act itself is direct and functional. Clay is shaped. Essence is applied. Life begins. There is no celebration of human uniqueness at this stage, no declaration of destiny. Humanity enters the world as a solution, not as a culmination. Shaping, however, begins immediately after creation, and never truly ends. Unlike creation, shaping is not tied to a single moment or decision. It unfolds through limits, restrictions, roles, and repeated exposure to consequence. The texts devote far more attention to this process because it is where stability is either achieved or lost. Creation establishes existence. Shaping establishes compatibility. A created being may live, but a shaped being can persist within a system. The Sumerian worldview prioritizes persistence over origin. What matters is not that humanity exists, but that humanity can continue without destabilizing the structures that support existence itself. This is why the texts do not linger on how humans were made, but dwell extensively on how humans must behave. Agriculture is regulated. Kingship is constrained. Ritual is formalized. Time is measured. These are shaping mechanisms. They do not alter human biology. They alter human behavior. The Anunnaki appear squarely within this shaping phase. They are not present at the moment of human creation. They are present when outcomes must be fixed, when limits must be enforced, when systems must be prevented from drifting too far from equilibrium. Their association with fate and judgment aligns them with shaping rather than origin. Creating humanity required power. Shaping humanity required patience. Power can act instantly. Patience unfolds slowly. The Sumerian texts reflect a deep understanding of this difference. A being created too quickly and left unshaped becomes a destabilizing force. Intelligence without constraint leads to excess. Productivity without limitation leads to depletion. Population without regulation leads to collapse. Shaping operates through boundaries rather than instruction. Humans are not told what they may become. They are shown what they cannot exceed. Lifespans are shortened. Resources are finite. Authority is distributed but limited. Even kings, who rule by divine sanction, are subject to removal, death, and replacement. No role is permanent. No individual is indispensable. This constant reinforcement of limitation is not framed as punishment. It is framed as necessity. The world described in the tablets cannot sustain infinite growth or unrestricted behavior. Shaping ensures that humanity learns this through lived experience rather than abstract teaching. The difference between creating and shaping is also reflected in the treatment of knowledge. At creation, humans possess consciousness but lack technique. Knowledge is introduced gradually and unevenly. Writing appears after cities exist. Law appears after conflict emerges. Medicine develops in response to suffering. not in anticipation of it. Each advancement reshapes humanity's relationship to the world without fundamentally altering human nature. The Anunnaki do not deliver these advancements, they monitor their effects. When new capabilities threaten balance, correction follows. This suggests that shaping is not about maximizing human potential, it is about aligning potential with sustainability. The flood narrative illustrates this distinction clearly. Humanity had been created long before the flood. It had also been shaped to a degree. Cities existed, kings ruled, civilization flourished, but shaping had not gone far enough. Population expanded beyond tolerable limits. Noise disrupted the system. Correction became necessary. The flood does not reverse creation. Humanity is not erased entirely. Instead, shaping intensifies. Lifespans are reduced. Mortality becomes fixed. Population controls are introduced. The world becomes harsher but more stable. These changes do not redefine humanity's essence. They redefine humanity's operating conditions. This reveals a critical aspect of preparation. Humanity is not being shaped for comfort. It is being shaped for continuity. Comfort encourages excess. Continuity requires restraint. The Sumerian texts consistently favour the latter. Even divine involvement changes as shaping progresses. Early in the narrative, gods interact more directly with humanity. Over time, this interaction becomes formalized and distant. Ritual replaces conversation. Omens replace instruction. Interpretation replaces command. This withdrawal is itself a shaping mechanism. Humanity must learn to act without immediate guidance. The Anunnaki's continued presence during this withdrawal underscores their role. They remain as guarantors of consequence even as other gods recede. Their authority does not depend on proximity. It depends on inevitability. Fate follows action whether gods are visible or not. Creating humanity established a participant in the system. Shaping humanity establishes responsibility. Responsibility requires consequence. Consequence requires enforcement. The Anunnaki occupy this enforcement role without becoming mentors or caretakers. The texts never suggest that shaping is complete. Even after major adjustments, instability returns. Cities fall, empires collapse, knowledge is lost and rediscovered. Each cycle reinforces the same lesson. Shaping is ongoing because conditions change. Preparation is never final. This ongoing nature explains why the texts resist framing humanity as a finished product. Humans are not perfected. They are managed. Their capacities are expanded and constrained as needed. When imbalance emerges, correction follows. The distinction between creating and shaping also clarifies why the Anunnaki are not associated with human innovation. Innovation emerges from necessity, not instruction. Humans adapt tools, systems, and customs in response to pressure. The gods allow this adaptation within limits. They intervene only when adaptation threatens stability. This produces a particular kind of civilization, one that values endurance over progress, memory over novelty, structure over freedom. These values are embedded in the shaping process rather than taught explicitly. Creation gives life. Shaping gives form. Life without form dissipates. Form without life stagnates. The Sumerian system balances the two through gradual adjustment rather than dramatic intervention. The Anunnaki's role within this balance is quiet but decisive. They do not initiate change, they finalize it. They do not propose direction, they enforce boundary. This keeps shaping responsive rather than rigid. Preparation, viewed through this lens, is not about readiness for an external event. It is about compatibility with a world that continues regardless of individual success or failure. Humanity is shaped to fit within that world, not to transcend it. As the narrative continues, this distinction will become increasingly important. Later developments build upon shaping rather than creation. Knowledge, authority, and memory will be redistributed. Divine presence will recede further. humanity will carry more responsibility without receiving more explanation. The difference between creating and shaping is the difference between existence and endurance. The Sumerian texts are far more concerned with the latter. Through limits, cycles, and consequence, humanity is being prepared not to arrive somewhere new, but to remain functional within a system that never stops adjusting. Labour occupies a central place in the Sumerian understanding of what humanity is and why it exists, but it is never framed as mere drudgery or punishment. In the oldest texts, labour is the mechanism through which order is sustained, and through which humanity is gradually shaped into something compatible with a complex, fragile world. This process is not rushed, it is not efficient, it unfolds slowly, across generations, embedding patterns of behaviour so deeply that they come to feel natural rather than imposed. From the moment humanity appears in the textual record, work is already waiting. Fields must be maintained, canals must be dug and cleared, temples must be built and repaired, offerings must be prepared on precise schedules. None of this is optional, and none of it is explained in philosophical terms. Labour is presented as a fact of existence, as fundamental as water or time. To live is to maintain. This framing is crucial. Humanity is not trained through instruction manuals or divine lectures, it is trained through repetition. Day after day, season after season, the same tasks return. Soil must be turned, water must be guided, structures must be reinforced. Errors are corrected not by explanation but by failure. A neglected canal floods unpredictably. A poorly built wall collapses. A missed planting season leads to hunger months later. The world itself enforces the lesson. This is not accidental. The Sumerian texts suggest an understanding that stable behaviour cannot be imposed instantly. It must be ingrained through habit. Labour creates rhythm, and rhythm creates expectation. Over time, expectation becomes internalised. Humanity learns not because it is told, but because deviation carries consequences that are difficult to ignore. The gods themselves are not exempt from this logic. Before humanity is created, the junior gods labour endlessly to maintain the world. They dig, build, and carry. They grow exhausted and resentful. This is not portrayed as noble suffering. It is described as unsustainable. Their complaint is not about injustice, but about imbalance. Too much labour concentrated in too few hands destabilises the system. Humanity is created to redistribute this burden, not to eliminate labour altogether. The workload shifts, but it does not disappear. This matters. If the goal were comfort, labour could have been minimised. Instead, labour is preserved and transferred. Humanity inherits it because labour itself is essential to maintaining order. This transfer initiates the slow training of a species. Humans are not simply workers, they are learners embedded in work. Every task reinforces awareness of limitation. Energy is finite, time is constrained, cooperation is necessary, mistakes have delayed consequences. These lessons do not require explanation. They are absorbed through lived experience. Order emerges from this process organically, not as an abstract principle, but as an observable necessity. Fields left unmanaged revert quickly. Water unguided becomes destructive. Communities without coordination fracture under pressure. Order is not imposed from above in these texts. It is demanded by the environment itself. The Anunnaki's role within this system is indirect but essential. They do not assign daily tasks. They do not oversee individual labourers. They operate at a higher level, ensuring that the outcomes of collective behaviour are stabilised. When labour produces balance, the system holds. When it produces excess or neglect, correction follows. This makes labour a feedback mechanism rather than a moral obligation. Work teaches proportion. Too little effort leads to scarcity. Too much expansion leads to strain. Humanity learns to operate within a narrow band where survival and continuity are possible. This band is not fixed. It shifts with population, climate, and social complexity. Labour forces humanity to adjust continually. Over generations, this adjustment shapes not just behaviour, but identity. Humans come to understand themselves as maintainers rather than conquerors. Even kings, the highest figures in society, are framed as shepherds rather than masters. Their role is to guide, protect, and sustain, not to dominate unchecked. When kings forget this, the texts record their downfall without sentimentality. Labour also structures time. Work is seasonal. Tasks repeat annually. This repetition anchors human consciousness in cycles rather than linear progression. Progress exists, but it is incremental and fragile. A single flood can erase decades of effort. This teaches humility without sermons. The slow pace of this training is deliberate. Rapid transformation would produce instability. A species given too much capability too quickly would disrupt the system it depends on. The Sumerian texts suggest awareness of this risk. Knowledge is introduced gradually. Techniques spread unevenly. Innovations are absorbed slowly into existing patterns rather than replacing them wholesale. Writing, for example, emerges first as an administrative tool. It records labour, goods, and obligations. Only later does it expand into literature, law, and myth. This mirrors the shaping process. Function precedes meaning. Utility precedes abstraction. Humanity is trained first to manage resources, then to manage memory, and only later to manage interpretation. The Anunnaki remain aligned with this progression. They are not associated with innovation bursts. They appear when systems require regulation. Their judgments fix outcomes rather than inspire creativity. This preserves a balance where human ingenuity can operate within boundaries without destabilizing the whole. Labour also enforces interdependence. No individual can maintain the system alone. Irrigation requires coordination. Construction requires cooperation. Ritual requires collective participation. This interdependence shapes social structures organically. Hierarchies emerge, but they are functional rather than absolute. Authority exists to organize labour, not to exempt itself from it. Even the divine hierarchy reflects this logic. Senior gods command, junior gods labour. Humans labour in turn. When labour becomes unbalanced at any level, tension arises. Correction follows. This repetition across divine and human realms reinforces the idea that labour is not degrading. It is foundational. The slow training of humanity through labour produces resilience rather than brilliance. The texts do not celebrate sudden breakthroughs. They preserve continuity. Civilizations rise because they master repetition, not because they innovate endlessly. When repetition breaks, collapse follows. This is why labour remains central even after catastrophe. After the flood, humanity resumes work almost immediately. The survivor's first act is sacrifice, but survival depends on rebuilding. Fields must be replanted. Communities must be reformed. The system restarts not through revelation, but through labour. This continuity reveals what humanity is being prepared for. Not transcendence, not escape. Sustained participation in a world that demands constant maintenance. Labour is the interface between humanity and order. Through it, humans learn where their influence ends and where larger forces take over. The Anunnaki's judgments reinforce this boundary. They do not eliminate labour. They ensure that its scale remains tolerable. When humanity multiplies beyond what labour can sustain, correction occurs. This is not framed as cruelty. It is framed as system preservation. Over time, labour shapes cognition itself. Humans learn to think in terms of process rather than outcome. Effort today affects survival months later. Actions ripple forward. Responsibility extends beyond immediate desire. These mental shifts are more durable than any spoken lesson. The texts do not describe this as education, but it functions as such. A slow, relentless training that aligns human behavior with environmental and systemic constraints. It is not kind. It is not cruel. It is necessary within the logic of the world being described. Labour also tempers ambition. Grand projects are possible, but they require immense coordination and risk. Ziggurats rise, but they demand continuous upkeep. When that upkeep fails, they decay. Monumentality is always provisional. This teaches impermanence without preaching it. The Anunnaki stand at the edge of this process. They do not reward labour with enlightenment. They reward it with continuation. Stability is the highest achievement the system recognises. Survival itself becomes success. The slow training of humanity through labour produces a species capable of enduring repetition, absorbing loss, and rebuilding without expectation of finality. There is no moment when labour ends. There is no point at which order becomes self-sustaining. Maintenance is perpetual. This perpetual maintenance is the core of preparation. Humanity is being shaped to live without resolution, to function without completion, to work without guarantee of permanence. The Anunnaki's role is not to explain this condition, but to enforce the boundaries that make it survivable. As the narrative continues, labour will remain a constant presence, even as forms of authority change and divine presence recedes. The system does not move toward ease, it moves toward balance. Through labour, humanity is trained to recognise that balance is fragile, temporary, and worth sustaining even when it demands continuous effort. Nothing here concludes. The work continues, as it always has, shaping humanity one repetition at a time within a world that remains in motion, requiring care not because it promises reward, but because neglect leads inevitably to collapse. Knowledge in the Sumerian text does not arrive as a complete structure. It is not delivered whole, nor is it framed as something humanity is entitled to possess in its entirety. Instead, it appears in pieces, scattered across generations, cities, professions, and rituals. This fragmentation is not portrayed as a limitation of the gods or a failure of communication. It is deliberate condition built into how humanity is shaped to exist within the world. From the earliest records, knowledge is unevenly distributed. Farmers know the soil and the seasons. Priests know the rituals and omens. Scribes know writing and calculation. Kings know law and command. No single group holds all understanding, and no text suggests that such completeness is desirable or even possible. This fragmentation creates dependency, cooperation, and restraint. It prevents any one perspective from becoming absolute. The gods themselves model this structure. No single deity governs everything. Domains are divided. Authority is compartmentalized. Even the most powerful gods operate within limits set by others. Knowledge follows the same pattern. It belongs to roles, not to individuals. It is accessed through function, not curiosity. This matters for preparation because complete knowledge would destabilize the system. Wholeness implies control. Control invites excess. Excess leads to imbalance. The Sumerian worldview is deeply aware of this chain. By fragmenting knowledge, the system limits humanity's ability to act without consequence. The texts repeatedly show that when knowledge accumulates too quickly, or concentrates too narrowly, disruption follows. Innovation outpaces regulation. Population outpaces resources. Noise outpaces tolerance. Correction becomes necessary. Fragmentation slows these processes. It introduces friction. It forces negotiation rather than unilateral action. Knowledge is also tied to timing. Certain information becomes available only when conditions demand it. Writing expands when administration becomes complex. Law codifies when conflict escalates. Medicine develops in response to suffering rather than in anticipation of it. This reactive distribution ensures that knowledge serves stability rather than ambition. The Anunnaki's role aligns closely with this structure. They are not depicted as fountains of wisdom dispensing insight freely. They are associated with fate, judgment, and boundary. They ensure that outcomes follow actions, not that understanding precedes them. Knowledge without consequence would invite experimentation without restraint. The Anunnaki enforce the opposite. This enforcement is quiet. There are no proclamations forbidding wholeness of knowledge. Instead, access is naturally limited by role, geography, and tradition. A scribe cannot farm. A farmer cannot interpret omens. A king cannot ignore ritual. Each role carries partial understanding and partial blindness. This blindness is protective. Fragmentation also preserves adaptability. If knowledge were complete and fixed, it would resist change. Partial knowledge can be revised, combined, and reinterpreted. The Sumerian texts show traditions evolving slowly over time. Stories shift. Emphases change. New gods rise in prominence. Old ones recede. Fragmentation allows this without collapsing the system. The gods themselves do not appear to possess total foresight. Decisions are debated. Outcomes surprise even divine figures. This suggests a cosmos where knowledge itself is contextual rather than absolute. Humanity mirrors this condition. Understanding is always provisional. The flood narrative reinforces this point. No human is given a complete explanation of why the flood occurs. The warning to the survivor is functional, not philosophical. Build the boat, preserve life. Do not ask for justification. Knowledge is limited to what is necessary for survival in that moment. Anything more would be irrelevant or dangerous. After the flood, humanity is not given a comprehensive new understanding of the world. Instead, new limits are imposed. Lifespans shorten. Mortality becomes fixed. Population controls appear. These changes reshape human experience without expanding human understanding. Knowledge remains fragmented, but conditions tighten. This pattern suggests that preparation is not about enlightenment. It is about containment. Humanity is not being prepared to comprehend the cosmos. It is being prepared to operate within it without destroying itself. Fragmented knowledge supports this goal by preventing overreach. The texts also show that knowledge carries burden as well as power. Those who know more are held to higher standards. Priests must perform rituals precisely. Scribes must record accurately. Kings must rule justly. Failure carries consequence. Fragmentation distributes this burden. No one bears it alone. Even divine knowledge is constrained by procedure. Decrees are issued through councils. Decisions require consensus. Fate is fixed through formal processes. This bureaucratic structure mirrors human institutions and reinforces the idea that knowledge must be managed carefully to prevent chaos. The Sumerian world does not reward those who seek total understanding. It rewards those who fulfill their role competently. Curiosity exists, but it is secondary to function. Knowledge that does not serve stability is treated with suspicion. This suspicion is visible in how certain figures are portrayed. Tricksters like Enki possess broad knowledge, but they also cause disruption. Their cleverness solves problems but introduces new complications. Knowledge without restraint becomes dangerous even in divine hands. Humanity inherits this lesson indirectly. Knowledge arrives with responsibility, and responsibility arrives with limitation. Fragmentation ensures that no single innovation can reshape the world too quickly. Changes propagate slowly, giving the system time to absorb them. The Anunnaki remain peripheral to the transmission of knowledge. They do not teach crafts. They do not invent writing. They do not explain agriculture. They judge outcomes. Their authority ensures that knowledge remains subordinate to balance. This structure also preserves mystery. Mystery is not a flaw in the Sumerian worldview. It is a stabilizing feature. Unknowns create caution. Caution slows action. Slower action reduces risk. The absence of complete understanding keeps humanity from acting as if it owns the world. Fragmentation also allows memory to function as a corrective. When knowledge is partial, memory fills gaps with experience. Traditions develop. Customs persist. These are not rational systems in the modern sense, but they are effective. They encode lessons learned through failure. Writing plays a crucial role here. It does not unify knowledge. It records fragments, lists, contracts, omens, stories. Each text preserves a slice of understanding tied to a specific context. Together, they form a mosaic rather than a blueprint. This mosaic resists totalization. No single reader can extract complete theory of existence from the tablets. Interpretation remains contested. This prevents dogma. It allows adaptation. The Anunnaki's silence reinforces this. They do not correct interpretations directly. They allow cultures to experiment within bounds. When experiments threaten stability, correction follows. Knowledge remains incomplete, but the system persists. Preparation through fragmentation produces humility. Humans learn that understanding is always partial. Decisions must be made despite uncertainty. Responsibility cannot be deferred to perfect knowledge. Action must occur within limits that are not fully explained. This condition persists as divine presence recedes. As gods become less visible, fragmentation becomes more pronounced. Humanity carries more responsibility with no increase in clarity. This is not abandonment, it is maturation within constraint. The Sumerian text never suggests that wholeness of knowledge will be achieved. There is no promised moment of revelation where everything becomes clear. Preparation is not oriented toward that kind of resolution. It is oriented toward continuity under uncertainty. Fragmented knowledge ensures that no generation believes it has finished learning. Each inherits partial understanding and adds to it cautiously. When additions destabilize the system, they are corrected or abandoned. This slow accumulation, punctuated by loss and rediscovery, defines the rhythm of Sumerian history. It is not progress in a linear sense. It is adjustment within a narrow range of survivable conditions. The Anunnaki's role within this rhythm is consistent. They do not expand knowledge, they contain its effects. They ensure that fragments do not assemble into something that overwhelms the system. Preparation, then, is not about assembling the whole picture. It is about learning to function without it. Humanity is shaped to accept that clarity is limited, that certainty is rare, and that survival depends on working responsibly within partial understanding. As the narrative continues, this fragmentation will remain central. Knowledge will be given, lost, recovered, and reshaped. Authority will shift. Memory will fracture and reassemble. Through all of this, the system holds because no single fragment becomes absolute. The world does not require humanity to know everything. It requires humanity not to exceed what it can sustain. Fragmented knowledge serves that purpose quietly, persistently, and without explanation, shaping a species capable of enduring uncertainty rather than mastering it. Time in the Sumerian worldview is not a backdrop against which events occur. It is an active force, one of the most powerful tools through which humanity is shaped. Unlike law, labour, or knowledge, time does not instruct, correct, or warn. It simply proceeds. And in that steady movement, it performs the work of preparation more effectively than any decree or explanation ever could. The oldest tablets never treat time as neutral. Cycles are observed, recorded, and respected long before they are understood. Days pass, seasons return, floods arrive and retreat. Generations replace one another. None of this is framed as optional or negotiable. Time moves whether humanity is ready or not, and that movement becomes the environment within which all learning takes place. This is a critical distinction. Preparation through time does not rely on awareness. It functions even when its effects are not recognized. A single human life is too short to grasp long patterns fully. Crops fail once and succeed the next season. Cities rise over decades and fall within weeks. Empires form across generations and vanish within a lifetime. Time ensures that no individual perspective dominates long enough to harden into certainty. The Sumerian texts reflect this by stretching narratives across impossible spans. Kings reign for thousands of years before the flood. Dynasties endure longer than memory can easily contain. These exaggerated chronologies are not errors in counting. They are expressions of scale. They remind the listener that the world operates on timelines that dwarf human experience. This vastness serves preparation by diminishing immediacy. When consequences unfold slowly, behavior adjusts without dramatic confrontation. A river that floods unpredictably one year becomes understood over generations. Planting practices change gradually. Settlement patterns shift incrementally. Time absorbs shock, smoothing correction into habit rather than crisis. The Anunnaki's association with fate aligns directly with this temporal function. Fate is not instantaneous punishment or reward. It is the fixing of outcomes within time. An action's significance may not be apparent when it occurs. Its consequence may surface years or generations later. This delay reinforces restraint. Humanity learns that not all effects are immediate, and that some consequences cannot be escaped simply by surviving the moment. Time also enforces humility. Knowledge gained in one era proves insufficient in the next. Practices that worked under one climate fail under another. Political arrangements that stabilize one generation collapse in the following. The texts preserve this instability without attempting to resolve it. Stability is always temporary. Continuity requires adjustment. This is why preparation unfolds across cycles rather than milestones. There is no single moment when humanity becomes ready. Readiness is never declared. It is tested repeatedly through recurrence. The same pressures return in altered forms. Each return reveals whether adaptation has occurred or stagnation has set in. Time fragments authority as effectively as it fragments knowledge. No ruler governs long enough to define the system permanently. No tradition remains unaltered across centuries. Even divine prominence shifts. Gods rise and recede. Cult centers change. Ritual emphasis evolves. This constant reconfiguration prevents rigidity. The Sumerian concept of kingship illustrates this clearly. Kingship descends from heaven, but kings themselves are temporary. They rule, fail, succeed, and die. Their authority is inherited, not created. Time ensures that no king becomes synonymous with kingship itself. The office persists, individuals pass. This pattern extends to cities. Eridu is first, but it does not remain dominant forever. Uruk rises, flourishes, others follow. Each city embodies a phase of development, and each eventually declines. Time ensures that no location becomes sacred beyond revision. Even the holiest centers fall silent. The Anunnaki's judgments occur within this temporal flow. They do not halt time, they operate through it. A fate decree does not always manifest immediately. It unfolds as circumstances align. This preserves the illusion of chance while maintaining structural order. Humanity experiences uncertainty, not control. Preparation through time also alters how memory functions. Memory becomes selective. Some events are preserved. Others fade. This is not loss alone. It is filtration. What survives long enough to be remembered becomes influential. What does not is absorbed into the background of existence. Writing extends memory, but even writing decays. Tablets break. Archives burn. Languages change. Interpretation shifts. Time ensures that no record remains authoritative forever. Each generation inherits fragments and reconstructs meaning based on present needs. This reconstruction is itself a form of preparation. Humanity learns to live without definitive answers. Meaning becomes provisional. Traditions are respected but revised. This flexibility prevents collapse when conditions change. The flood narrative demonstrates time's corrective function vividly. The catastrophe resets conditions dramatically. But what follows is not a return to the old world. It is a recalibration. Lifespans shorten. Mortality becomes absolute. Human time becomes compressed. This compression intensifies experience. Decisions carry greater weight when time is limited. Shortened lifespans accelerate learning. Mistakes propagate faster. Knowledge must be transmitted more efficiently. Social structures tighten. Law becomes necessary. Writing expands. These developments are not gifts of enlightenment. They are adaptations to temporal pressure. Time also introduces scarcity. There is never enough of it. This scarcity forces prioritization. Not all knowledge can be pursued. Not all projects can be completed. Humanity learns to choose, and choice carries consequence. This is preparation through limitation. The Anunnaki's role within this compressed time becomes more pronounced. Judgment must occur sooner. Fate must be fixed more frequently. The system becomes more responsive. This does not make it kinder. It makes it sustainable under new conditions. Time also separates humanity from direct divine presence. Early generations interact more closely with gods. Later ones rely on ritual and interpretation. Distance grows as time accumulates. This distance forces humanity to act without immediate confirmation. Responsibility increases as certainty diminishes. This withdrawal is not abrupt. It unfolds over centuries. Time cushions the transition. Humanity adapts gradually to silence. Ritual fills gaps. Tradition substitutes for instruction. This slow shift prevents shock. Preparation through time also means that no generation is fully aware of what it is being prepared for. Each experiences only its portion of the process. Perspective remains partial. This prevents resistance. Change feels normal because it unfolds within lived experience rather than appearing as an external imposition. The Sumerian texts never present time as something to be conquered. Attempts to defy time to achieve permanence are depicted as futile. Monuments erode, names are forgotten, even gods change. Time asserts itself without conflict. This acceptance shapes behaviour. Effort is invested in maintenance rather than immortality. Continuity matters more than legacy. Survival outweighs recognition. These values are not preached. They are learned through repetition. The Anunnaki operate within this acceptance. They do not promise eternity. They manage transition. Their authority persists because it aligns with time rather than opposing it. They judge what has occurred, not what might have been. Preparation through time also dissolves urgency. When everything unfolds slowly, panic loses power. Humanity learns to endure rather than react. This endurance is not passive, it is adaptive. Structures evolve, customs adjust, memory reshapes. Time ensures that preparation cannot be rushed. Even divine intervention respects temporal flow. When correction occurs, it does not instantly perfect the system. It introduces new conditions that require further adaptation. The process continues. This continuity explains why the texts resist finality. There is no end state, no completed preparation. Time never stops, so preparation never concludes. Humanity is always in transition, always adjusting to new pressures shaped by accumulated consequence. The Anunnaki's judgments mark points within this flow, not its termination. They fix outcomes so that movement can continue without disintegrating. They close one phase so another can begin. Preparation through time produces resilience rather than certainty. Humanity learns to live with delay, loss, and gradual change. This capacity becomes more important than any specific knowledge or skill. As the narrative continues, time will remain the silent force guiding every development. Knowledge will fragment and reassemble, authority will rise and fall, divine presence will recede further. None of this will be announced. It will simply occur, carried forward by the steady movement that has always shaped existence. The system does not prepare humanity by revealing what lies ahead. It prepares humanity by ensuring that whatever lies ahead will be encountered gradually, within the limits of endurance shaped by generations of exposure to time itself. The rise of cities in the Sumerian world is never presented as a break from nature, but as an attempt to live more precisely within it. Cities are not described as triumphs over the environment. They are described as arrangements that depend entirely on understanding cycles and responding to them correctly. When cities appear in the texts, they do so alongside calendars, rituals and schedules, all of which serve the same purpose: aligning human activity with patterns that already exist. The earliest cities emerge where cycles are most visible and most demanding. Rivers flood and retreat with regularity, but not with perfect predictability. Soil accumulates over time, but only if water is managed carefully. Heat intensifies seasonally. Winds shift. These patterns shape settlement long before walls are built. Cities arise not because humans decide to dominate space, but because they need fixed points from which to coordinate response to repeating pressures. Once cities exist, calendars become unavoidable. Agriculture requires timing. Labour must be organised. Offerings must occur on specific days. Festivals repeat annually. These are not cultural embellishments. They are survival tools. A city without a calendar cannot coordinate its labour or anticipate scarcity. The calendar becomes a shared memory of cycles that no individual lifespan could fully track alone. This shared memory is itself a form of preparation. Humanity learns to think beyond the immediate moment. Actions are scheduled with future consequence in mind. Planting anticipates harvest months away. Storage anticipates famine years ahead. Construction anticipates floods that have not yet arrived. The calendar trains the population to live in anticipation rather than reaction. The Sumerian texts emphasize this training subtly. They list months, festivals, offerings, and duties without explaining their deeper significance. Repetition does the work. By participating year after year, individuals internalize patterns. Ritual becomes memory enacted. Time becomes structured without requiring comprehension of its full scope. Cities amplify this effect. Dense populations require coordination. Individual intuition is no longer sufficient. The success of one household depends on the timing of many others. Irrigation systems must be maintained collectively. Walls must be repaired before storms arrive. Markets must operate on predictable schedules. Cities force humanity to synchronize behavior. This synchronization is not framed as liberation. It is framed as necessity. A city out of rhythm collapses quickly. The texts record abandoned cities without sentiment. Ruins are facts, not tragedies. When cycles are ignored or misjudged, correction follows without explanation. The Anunnaki's presence intersects with this process indirectly. They are not associated with founding cities or inventing calendars. They appear when cities fail, when cycles are broken, when imbalance becomes unsustainable. Their judgments mark the consequences of misalignment rather than providing instruction on how to avoid it. Calendars also introduce hierarchy into time. Some days matter more than others. Some periods demand restraint. Others permit expansion. This hierarchy teaches prioritization. Not all actions are appropriate at all times. Timing becomes as important as intention. This lesson extends beyond agriculture. Warfare, diplomacy, and law all operate within temporal cycles. Treaties expire, debts mature, punishments are delayed or enacted on specific dates. Time becomes a regulatory force that disciplines behavior without requiring constant enforcement. Cities institutionalize this discipline. Temples anchor ritual calendars. Administrative buildings track obligations. Archives preserve records that tie past actions to future consequences. Writing becomes inseparable from timekeeping. A written contract is meaningless without a date. A law requires a moment of enactment. The repetition of cycles also tempers ambition. Expansion is possible, but it must align with seasonal capacity. Overbuilding before floods invites destruction. Overharvesting before replenishment invites famine. The city teaches restraint through shared vulnerability. This vulnerability is collective. Individual failure can be absorbed, systemic failure cannot. Cities magnify the cost of misalignment. When one canal collapses, many fields suffer. When one ritual is neglected, uncertainty spreads. This collective exposure reinforces conformity to cycles without overt coercion. The Sumerian worldview does not treat this conformity as oppression. It treats it as adaptation. Freedom exists, but within bounds defined by time and environment. Cities make those bounds visible. The Anunnaki's judgments often occur at the level of cities rather than individuals. Floods erase settlements, plagues thin populations, political collapse resets structures. These corrections are not targeted moral responses. They are systemic recalibrations. Calendars persist through these disruptions. After catastrophe, time resumes. Months are named again. Festivals return. Labour cycles restart. This continuity teaches that even destruction operates within larger rhythms. Nothing is final. The city then becomes a training ground for endurance within cycles. It conditions humanity to expect repetition, to plan for return, and to accept loss as temporary rather than terminal. Memory is distributed across institutions rather than lodged in individuals. This distribution is crucial. Individuals die. Cities endure longer. Calendars outlast rulers. By embedding knowledge in structures, humanity extends learning beyond lifespan. This extension is preparation for a world where divine guidance becomes less direct. As gods recede, calendars remain. Ritual continues even when belief shifts. Timekeeping becomes secularized, but its function remains unchanged. Humanity continues to live within cycles because survival still depends on it. The Anunnaki's role in this later phase remains consistent. They are associated with endpoints rather than beginnings. When cycles are violated repeatedly, when adaptation fails, they appear as arbiters of consequence. They do not dismantle time, they enforce its cost. Cities also introduce cycles of power. Dynasties rise and fall. Administrative reforms replace older systems. Authority rotates. This rotation prevents stagnation. No structure remains dominant indefinitely. Time dissolves monopolies. The Sumerian texts do not celebrate these shifts. They record them. Change is not framed as progress. It is framed as adjustment. Cities persist by adapting to cycles of environment, population, and power. Calendars make these adaptations possible by providing reference points. Without them, memory fragments. With them, continuity becomes achievable. Preparation depends on this continuity. The repetition of cycles also reduces fear of uncertainty. When floods return regularly, they become expected rather than shocking. When droughts recur, storage strategies develop. Familiarity does not eliminate hardship, but it reduces paralysis. This reduction of paralysis is essential. A population overwhelmed by fear cannot maintain order. Cycles transform fear into anticipation. Anticipation enables preparation. The Anunnaki's judgments reinforce anticipation by making consequence reliable. When thresholds are crossed, correction occurs. The timing may vary, but the pattern holds. This reliability underwrites trust in the system, even when it is harsh. Cities encode this trust structurally. Walls, granaries, and archives embody confidence that the future will arrive and can be prepared for. This confidence persists even after disaster. Rebuilding assumes recurrence. Preparation through cycles is never complete. Each generation must learn them anew. Calendars are taught, rituals repeated, cities maintained. Forgetting invites collapse, remembering enables survival. The Sumerian texts preserve this process without explanation, because explanation is unnecessary. Participation teaches more effectively than instruction. Living within cycles reshapes expectation and behavior over time. The Anunnaki's silence on instruction reinforces this. They do not teach calendars. They respond when calendars are ignored. They do not design cities. They judge when cities exceed capacity. This division of roles keeps preparation grounded. Humanity learns by living. Gods enforce boundaries when learning fails. As the narrative continues, cities and calendars will remain central. Even as empires expand and contract, even as languages change, the need to align with cycles persists. Time does not loosen its grip. It deepens it. Humanity is not being prepared to escape cycles. It is being prepared to inhabit them without self-destruction. Cities and calendars are the tools through which this preparation becomes durable, embedding awareness of repetition into daily life without requiring conscious reflection. The work is slow. It spans centuries. It tolerates failure. It absorbs loss. It continues because time continues, and within that continuity, humanity learns to live not by mastering cycles, but by respecting them. The Sumerian texts are remarkably restrained when it comes to foresight. They do not outline the future. They do not warn humanity of specific events to come. They do not describe an ultimate goal toward which history is moving. This silence is not an omission caused by loss or ignorance. It is a structural feature of how preparation operates in this worldview. Humanity was never told what was coming, because being told would have undermined the very conditions the system required to remain stable. Foreknowledge changes behavior in ways that are difficult to contain. If humanity had been informed of future catastrophes, cycles, or transitions, action would no longer be shaped by adaptation but by anticipation. Anticipation invites manipulation. Manipulation accelerates imbalance. The Sumerian system avoids this by keeping the future opaque. Instead of prophecy, the texts emphasize recurrence. Floods happen, cities fall, dynasties end. These events are recorded after they occur, not before. Meaning is assigned retrospectively rather than predictively. Humanity learns from what has happened, not from what is promised or threatened. This approach preserves responsibility. When outcomes are unknown, decisions must be made based on present conditions rather than imagined futures. This anchors behavior in reality rather than speculation. A population focused on surviving current cycles is less likely to destabilize itself chasing or avoiding distant possibilities. The absence of foresight also prevents paralysis. Knowing what is coming can immobilize action. Fear of inevitable catastrophe can erode effort. The Sumerian texts do not allow this. Even after immense destruction, life resumes. Work continues. Cities are rebuilt. The future remains undefined, which makes continued participation possible. The Anunnaki's role reinforces this opacity. They are associated with fate, but fate is fixed after action, not revealed beforehand. Fate in this sense is not destiny awaiting fulfillment. It is the formalization of consequence once thresholds have been crossed. This keeps humanity oriented toward present conduct rather than future anxiety. Where warnings do appear, they are specific, limited, and functional. The flood narrative provides the clearest example. The survivor is warned of an imminent event, but not of the broader implications. He is told to build, to preserve life. He is not told how the world will change afterward. He is not told why humanity as a whole must suffer. The warning serves survival, not understanding. This distinction matters. Information is provided only when action must be taken immediately and cannot be learned through experience alone. Everything else is withheld. Humanity is allowed to discover meaning through aftermath rather than anticipation. This restraint also prevents hierarchy of foresight. If some humans knew what was coming and others did not, power would concentrate dangerously. Those with knowledge could manipulate those without it. The Sumerian system avoids this by limiting foresight almost entirely. Even kings do not possess clear visions of the future. Omens are ambiguous. Dreams require interpretation. Certainty is rare. Ambiguity enforces caution. When signs are unclear, actions tend to be conservative. Radical transformation becomes risky. Incremental adjustment becomes preferable. This slows change to a survivable pace. The texts show that when certainty does arise, it often leads to disruption. Divine decrees that promise drastic outcomes provoke resistance or subversion. The flood itself generates conflict among the gods. Enki circumvents the decision precisely because absolute certainty leaves no room for adjustment. Afterward, the system becomes more restrained, not less. This shift suggests that even the gods recognize the danger of too much clarity. Absolute foreknowledge collapses flexibility. A system that cannot adjust cannot endure. Humanity's ignorance of what is coming also preserves learning. When outcomes are not known in advance, each generation must interpret events anew. This keeps memory active rather than static. Traditions are questioned, refined, or abandoned based on experience. Knowledge remains dynamic. The Sumerian texts preserve multiple versions of the same stories, often with contradictions. This is not confusion. It is tolerance for uncertainty. Different communities remember differently because the future was never fixed enough to demand a single narrative. The Anunnaki's silence fits within this tolerance. They do not correct divergent interpretations directly. They allow plurality as long as stability is maintained. When plurality threatens order, correction occurs through consequence rather than explanation. The lack of foresight also aligns with the role of labour and cycles. Work must be done regardless of what lies ahead. Fields must be tended, canals cleared, rituals performed. Knowing the future would not reduce this necessity. It might only erode motivation. By keeping the future undefined, the system ensures that effort remains grounded in present need. Survival today matters more than speculation about tomorrow. This approach also prevents premature finality. If humanity believed it was being prepared for a specific event, preparation would narrow. Resources would be allocated toward that outcome at the expense of others. When the event failed to arrive, collapse would follow. The Sumerian texts avoid this trap by never naming an endpoint. Preparation becomes general rather than specific. Humanity is shaped to endure a range of conditions rather than to meet a single challenge. Flexibility replaces precision. This is more sustainable over long time spans. The absence of prophecy also reduces blame. When catastrophe occurs, it is not framed as failure to heed warnings. It is framed as crossing thresholds. Responsibility is collective and structural rather than moralistic. This prevents cycles of guilt and recrimination that can fracture societies. The Anunnaki's judgments reflect this. They do not punish individuals for ignoring prophecy. They correct systems that exceed limits. The focus remains on balance, not obedience. This also explains why the texts rarely moralize disaster. Floods do not occur because humans are evil. They occur because conditions become untenable. This framing preserves dignity even in loss. Humanity is not condemned. It is corrected. The lack of forewarning also maintains momentum. A world that constantly anticipates disaster may stagnate. Innovation halts. Expansion ceases. The Sumerian world continues to build, trade, and experiment despite risk. This activity is essential to learning what works and what fails. Time plays a crucial role here. Without foresight, time becomes the teacher. Patterns reveal themselves only through repetition. Generations observe outcomes and adjust gradually. This slow feedback loop prevents catastrophic swings. The Anunnaki's authority operates within this temporal loop. They enforce consequence when thresholds are crossed, but they do not accelerate revelation. Their silence preserves the pace. Humanity's ignorance of what is coming also supports psychological endurance. Uncertainty can be tolerated indefinitely. Certainty of doom cannot. By withholding definitive forecasts, the system allows hope, even if that hope is unfounded. Hope sustains effort. The texts do not condemn hope as illusion. They simply do not ground it in promises. Hope arises from continuity rather than assurance. The world has persisted before. It may persist again. This continuity is visible in how quickly normalcy resumes after catastrophe. Survivors rebuild, calendars restart, rituals resume. Life continues without explanation. The absence of a revealed future makes this continuation possible. The Sumerian worldview accepts that some knowledge arrives only too late to prevent suffering. This is not seen as cruelty. It is seen as reality. Preparation does not eliminate pain. It reduces total collapse. The Anunnaki's judgments mark boundaries, not trajectories. They ensure that movement remains within survivable limits without dictating direction. Humanity chooses paths within those limits, without knowing where they ultimately lead. This freedom within constraint is essential. It allows diversity of response. Different cities adapt differently. Some succeed, others fail. The system learns through variation. Foreknowledge would homogenize response. Everyone would act the same way to avoid the same outcome. This uniformity would magnify failure if the strategy proved flawed. Fragmented ignorance allows multiple experiments to run simultaneously. The Sumerian texts preserve this multiplicity. They do not standardize future expectation. They standardize response to failure. Preparation without foresight produces resilience rather than certainty. Humanity learns to function under ambiguity, to act without guarantee, to recover from error without explanation. This capacity outlasts any specific knowledge of what lies ahead. The Anunnaki's silence ensures that this capacity remains central. They do not reveal the destination because the destination is not the point. Endurance is. As the narrative continues, this absence of forewarning will remain consistent. Even as divine presence recedes further, even as human responsibility increases, the future remains undefined. Humanity is left to navigate cycles without a map, guided only by memory, structure, and consequence. What is coming is never named because naming it would collapse preparation into anticipation. The system does not prepare humanity for an event. It prepares humanity for uncertainty itself, shaping a species capable of continuing to act, build, and adapt without ever being told what tomorrow holds. Silence in Sumerian cosmology is not absence, it is function. It occupies space deliberately, shaping behavior and expectation without drawing attention to itself. The texts do not treat silence as a gap to be filled, nor as a failure of communication. They treat it as an active condition through which order is preserved and preparation continues without interruption. From the earliest tablets, what is left unsaid carries as much weight as what is recorded. Events occur without commentary. Decisions are issued without justification. Consequences follow without explanation. This restraint creates a world in which meaning is not handed down fully formed, but must be inferred through experience over time. Silence becomes the medium through which endurance is cultivated. The gods themselves operate within silence. They do not constantly announce their presence. They do not narrate their intentions. Divine speech is rare, formal, and often indirect. When gods act, they do so without explanation, allowing outcomes to speak for themselves. This is not secrecy, it is discipline. Silence limits dependency. A world saturated with instruction produces reliance. A world structured around silence produces attentiveness. Humans must watch, remember, and adjust. They cannot wait for clarification. They must respond to conditions as they unfold. This fosters a particular kind of awareness grounded in observation rather than doctrine. In Sumerian cosmology, silence is closely tied to authority. The most powerful figures speak the least. Senior gods issue decrees, not arguments. Kings rule through command, not persuasion. Law is recorded, not debated publicly. Silence reinforces hierarchy without requiring constant enforcement. This pattern extends to ritual. Rituals are precise, repetitive, and rarely explained. Participants perform actions because they have always been performed. The meaning is embedded in the act itself, not in spoken interpretation. Silence ensures continuity. Explanation would invite reinterpretation. Reinterpretation would destabilize practice. The Anunnaki fit seamlessly into this structure. They are associated with judgment, fate, and the underworld, realms where silence dominates. The underworld is not described in vivid detail. It is defined by stillness, finality, and the absence of dialogue. The Anunnaki do not argue their judgments. They issue them. Silence marks the end of negotiation. This association reinforces the idea that silence is not passive. It is the condition under which decisions become irreversible. Speech belongs to process. Silence belongs to outcome. Once silence descends, the system moves forward without debate. The texts reflect this by shifting tone after major events. After creation, activity increases. After catastrophe, silence expands. The flood narrative, for example, moves from description of action to a quieter aftermath. The world resets without explanation. Survivors act, but the cosmos does not speak. Silence also structures time. Periods of intense activity are followed by stretches where nothing is said. These gaps are not empty. They allow memory to settle. They prevent saturation. A constant stream of meaning would overwhelm. Silence allows integration. The Sumerian king list exemplifies this. Long reigns are listed without narrative detail. Names and numbers replace stories. This silence around individual lives emphasizes continuity over personality. Kings matter because they occupy a role, not because of what they say or do. Silence erases individuality in favor of structure. This erasure is part of preparation. Humanity is trained to think in terms of roles rather than personal narratives. Identity becomes functional. Contribution matters more than expression. Silence supports this by limiting self-interpretation. The god's silence also prevents moral absolutism. Without explicit divine commentary, humans cannot claim full alignment with divine will. Interpretation remains tentative. This tentativeness reduces fanaticism. No group can claim complete understanding when the gods themselves remain largely silent. Even when omens appear, they do not speak clearly. Signs require interpretation. Interpretations vary. Certainty is elusive. Silence surrounds meaning, forcing caution. Decisions must be made without assurance. The Anunnaki's judgments occur at the end of this interpretive process. They finalize outcomes without clarifying reasoning. This maintains authority while preserving ambiguity. Humans know that limits exist, but not exactly where they lie until they are crossed. Silence also protects the system from escalation. Verbal justification invites challenge. Challenge invites conflict. Conflict threatens stability. Silence short-circuits this progression. A decree issued without explanation cannot be argued against effectively. The system moves on. This does not eliminate dissent. It contains it. Dissent manifests through action rather than speech. Cities adapt. Rituals shift subtly. Traditions evolve quietly. Change occurs but slowly without confrontation. Silence is especially prominent around divine withdrawal. As gods recede from direct interaction, they do not announce their departure. There is no declaration of absence. Presence fades gradually. Humanity adapts without formal acknowledgement. Silence cushions the transition. This gradual withdrawal is itself a form of preparation. Humans learn to operate without immediate feedback. Responsibility increases as certainty decreases. Silence becomes the environment within which autonomy develops. The Anunnaki remain as figures of consequence within this silent framework. They do not fill the silence with instruction. They ensure that silence does not become chaos. Their judgments punctuate silence rather than replacing it. The underworld, governed by the Anunnaki, embodies this principle fully. It is a realm without speech, without negotiation, without change. Entry is final. Silence marks the end of motion. This finality gives weight to action in the living world. Knowing that silence awaits reinforces restraint. This is not fear-based control. It is structural awareness. Life is active because silence exists as a boundary. Action has meaning because it leads eventually to stillness. Silence also shapes memory. What is not recorded must be remembered differently. Oral tradition fills gaps, but it changes with retelling. Silence allows stories to adapt. Fixed explanation would freeze meaning. Silence allows evolution. The Sumerian texts preserve multiple versions of myths precisely because silence surrounds authoritative interpretation. No single version silences the others. This plurality maintains flexibility. The Anunnaki do not intervene to standardize narrative. They allow divergence as long as order holds. Silence permits variation without collapse. This tolerance is strategic. A rigid system breaks under pressure. A flexible one absorbs shock. Silence is the space in which flexibility operates. Preparation through silence also affects emotional regulation. Without constant reassurance or warning, humanity learns to manage uncertainty internally. Anxiety becomes part of existence, but it is moderated by routine, ritual, and repetition. The absence of divine commentary during hardship prevents expectation of rescue. Effort continues because it must. This persistence is critical to survival. Silence removes the temptation to wait for intervention. Even when divine help occurs, it is subtle. Dreams, omens, indirect speech. Silence remains dominant. Assistance does not replace responsibility. The Anunnaki's authority is enhanced by silence. They do not need to speak often because their judgments are final. Words would add nothing. Their power lies in inevitability rather than persuasion. Silence also prevents saturation of meaning. A world filled with explanation would dull attention. Silence sharpens it. Humans learn to notice small changes. Patterns become visible because noise is limited. This attentiveness supports adaptation. When cycles shift slightly, silence allows detection. Explanation would lag behind reality. Silence keeps perception aligned with conditions rather than narratives. The Sumerian cosmology does not treat silence as comforting. It treats it as necessary. Comfort is secondary to stability. Silence may be unsettling, but it sustains order. The god's silence does not imply indifference. It implies confidence in the system. Intervention is reserved for thresholds, not for guidance. This restraint keeps the system scalable across time. As divine presence recedes further, silence expands. Humanity fills it with law, ritual, and memory. These substitutes are imperfect, but they function within the silent framework. The Anunnaki remain at the edge of this expansion, ensuring that silence does not dissolve into meaninglessness. Their judgments anchor silence in consequence. Preparation through silence shapes a humanity capable of acting without affirmation. Decisions are made without certainty. Effort continues without guarantee. This capacity becomes essential as time progresses. Silence also limits hubris. Without explicit divine endorsement, humans cannot claim ultimate authority. Power remains provisional. This prevents total domination by any single ideology. The Sumerian texts never suggest that silence will end. There is no promised revelation where everything becomes clear. Silence persists because it performs work that speech cannot. As the narrative continues, silence will remain a defining feature. Knowledge will fragment, authority will shift, cycles will repeat. Through all of this, silence will shape perception. restrain excess, and allow adaptation without instruction. The role of silence is not to obscure truth, it is to prevent premature certainty. In a world where preparation is ongoing and outcomes unfold slowly, certainty would be more dangerous than ignorance. The Anunnaki's silence ensures that preparation remains a process rather than a declaration. Humanity is shaped not by what it is told, but by what it must live with. Silence provides that condition, steady and unbroken, allowing the system to continue without needing to explain itself. The Sumerian texts never framed the Anunnaki as rescuers arriving at moments of crisis to restore comfort or reverse loss. They are not described as figures who intervene to preserve what already exists simply because it exists. Instead, they appear most clearly at points where one state of affairs is ending and another must begin. Their role is transitional rather than restorative, administrative rather than salvational. This distinction changes everything about how their actions should be understood. In a worldview shaped by cycles, endurance, and consequence, salvation would be destabilizing. To save something is to freeze it, to declare that it must not change. The Sumerian system does not value permanence in this way. It values continuity through transformation. The Anunnaki operate within that logic. They do not protect forms. They regulate transitions. This is visible in where they appear and where they do not. They are absent during periods of growth and expansion. They do not guide cities as they rise. They do not instruct kings during prosperous reigns. They do not intervene when systems function within acceptable bounds. Their presence becomes pronounced only when thresholds are crossed, and continuation in the same form is no longer possible. In these moments, the Anunnaki do not reverse events. They finalize them. They assign outcomes that allow the system to move forward in altered form. This is not mercy in the modern sense. It is management. A system that cannot transition cleanly collapses entirely. Administration ensures that collapse is partial rather than total. The flood narrative illustrates this clearly. The Anunnaki are associated with the judgment that follows the decision to reset conditions. They do not descend to save cities. They do not warn populations. They do not preserve institutions. The world is allowed to be undone. Only afterward does a new phase begin, smaller, constrained, and more stable. This is not rescue. It is recalibration. Salvation would imply favoritism. It would suggest that certain outcomes are inherently preferable and must be preserved at all costs. The Sumerian texts do not support this view. Cities are not sacred forever. Kings are not indispensable. Even divine arrangements are subject to revision. The Anunnaki administer these revisions without sentiment. This absence of sentiment is often misread as cruelty or indifference. Within the Sumerian framework, it is neither. It is consistency. Administration requires impartiality. A system cannot be managed if exceptions become routine. Salvation creates exceptions. Transition enforces limits. The Anunnaki's association with fate underscores this role. Fate is not destiny imposed from the beginning. It is the assignment of outcome at the moment when continuation requires closure. Fate fixes what has become unsustainable. It does not rescue what has already exceeded its bounds. This is why the Anunnaki are linked to the underworld rather than the heavens. The underworld is not a place of torment or reward in early Sumerian thought. It is a place of finality. Things that enter it do not return unchanged. Administration belongs to endings, not beginnings. The Anunnaki's judgments are therefore not interventions in the middle of processes. They occur at points where processes must conclude. This allows new processes to begin without unresolved tension carrying forward. The system sheds weight to survive. This shedding is visible across multiple domains. Population is reduced, lifespans are shortened, knowledge is lost and rediscovered. Authority structures collapse and reform. None of this is framed as failure. It is framed as adjustment. Salvation would prevent this adjustment. If humanity were consistently saved from consequence, it would never recalibrate. Excess would accumulate. Imbalance would intensify. Collapse would eventually become total rather than partial. The Sumerian worldview anticipates this danger. It avoids the language of rescue deliberately. Even gods who sympathize with humanity do not openly oppose correction. They work around it quietly, preserving continuity without blocking transition. The Anunnaki remain firm in this context. They do not negotiate outcomes, they implement them. This does not make them antagonists. It makes them necessary for system survival. This role also explains why they are not celebrated in hymns as benevolent guardians. They are respected, feared, and acknowledged, but not adored. Their function is not to comfort, it is to conclude. Administration of transition requires distance. Emotional involvement would compromise judgment. The Anunnaki's relative silence and formality reinforce this distance. They are not approachable because approachability invites appeal. Appeal delays closure. This does not mean that transitions are arbitrary. They follow patterns. Thresholds exist. When exceeded, response occurs. Humanity learns these patterns indirectly through repetition. Cities that overextend fall. Societies that ignore limits fragment. These outcomes become expected over time. The Anunnaki's authority ensures that these expectations remain reliable. Without reliable consequence, patterns dissolve, preparation fails. This reliability also discourages mythic heroism. There is no figure who can plead humanity out of consequence entirely. Even divine intermediaries operate within constraints. Appeals may soften outcomes, but they do not erase the need for transition. This constraint preserves dignity. Humanity is not infantilized by rescue. It is treated as a participant in a system where actions matter. Loss is not meaningless. It contributes to recalibration. The distinction between saviors and administrators becomes clearer when examining how the texts treat survival. Survival is not framed as reward. Those who survive do not inherit the old world intact. They inherit a changed world with tighter limits. Survival carries responsibility, not privilege. This is evident after the flood. The survivor does not rule a restored civilization. He is removed from ordinary human life. Humanity continues under new constraints. Survival preserves continuity, not supremacy. The Anunnaki's role in this outcome is not to elevate the survivor, but to contain him. Eternal life is not a blessing in the social sense. It is isolation. The survivor becomes a boundary marker between epochs, not a leader of the new order. This treatment reinforces the idea that transitions must be clean. Elements of the old world cannot dominate the new. Administration ensures separation. Salvation would blur these boundaries. It would allow old structures to persist beyond their viability. The Sumerian system avoids this by assigning endings decisively. The Anunnaki's judgments also extend beyond catastrophe. They appear in myths where divine figures face consequences. Even gods are not immune to transition. Status changes, authority shifts, roles evolve, administration applies across realms. This universality strengthens the system. No level of existence is exempt. Humanity is not singled out for harsh treatment. It is part of a broader pattern. The absence of saviour figures also prevents dependency. A population accustomed to rescue becomes fragile. A population accustomed to transition becomes resilient. The Sumerian texts favour the latter. Resilience does not mean comfort. It means capacity to rebuild. Cities are rebuilt after destruction. Institutions reform. Memory persists even when form changes. This persistence is the true achievement the system values. The Anunnaki facilitate this by ensuring that transitions do not stall. Stalled transitions produce instability. Lingering between states invites conflict. Closure allows movement. This movement is not linear, it cycles. Each transition prepares humanity for the next. The system does not aim for a final stable state. It aims for survivable fluctuation. Salvation would aim for stasis. Administration aims for flow. The Anunnaki embody the latter. This also explains why they are often misunderstood in later interpretations. Modern frameworks value rescue narratives. They seek benevolent figures who intervene decisively to prevent suffering. The Sumerian worldview operates differently. It accepts suffering as part of adjustment. It seeks to prevent total collapse rather than individual pain. The Anunnaki's lack of sentiment aligns with this priority. They do not alleviate hardship unless it threatens system integrity. Individual suffering is not their focus. Continuity is. This does not render human experience meaningless. It contextualizes it. Meaning arises from endurance, adaptation, and memory, not from exemption. The texts do not condemn humans for suffering. They record it. They integrate it into the pattern of transitions. Over time, this normalizes loss without glorifying it. The Anunnaki's role is to ensure that loss leads somewhere, that it marks a boundary rather than a void. Administration gives direction to endings. This direction is often invisible in the moment. Those experiencing transition do not see its necessity. Only later does adjustment become apparent. This delayed understanding reinforces humility. Humanity is not positioned as capable of judging transitions fully. The system does not require consent to operate. It requires participation. The Anunnaki operate beyond appeal because appeal would require shared perspective. Shared perspective would imply equality of understanding. The Sumerian worldview does not assume this equality. This hierarchy of perspective does not imply malice. It implies scale. Those who oversee transitions operate on longer timelines. Immediate suffering weighs less than long-term viability. This scale difference is essential to preparation. Humanity is shaped to endure not because it understands everything, but because it survives adjustments it did not choose. As divine presence recedes, this administrative function becomes even more critical. Without frequent intervention, boundaries must be enforced reliably. The Anunnaki's authority provides that enforcement without constant engagement. This allows humanity to operate with increasing autonomy within limits. Autonomy without boundaries leads to collapse. Boundaries without autonomy lead to stagnation. Administration balances the two. The Anunnaki are therefore neither enemies nor protectors in the conventional sense. They are custodians of thresholds. They mark when one phase must end so another can begin. This custodianship is not celebrated. It is accepted. Fear and respect replace devotion. This emotional distance supports clarity. As the narrative continues, this role will become more pronounced. Divine presence will thin. Human responsibility will expand. Transitions will continue to occur. The Anunnaki will remain associated with endings rather than rescues. Preparation unfolds through these endings. Humanity learns that survival does not mean preservation of form. It means capacity to continue under new conditions. The Anunnaki administer these conditions without apology or explanation. Their silence underscores their function. They are not there to save humanity from change. They are there to ensure that change does not destroy everything. In this system, salvation would be a failure of management. Transition is the mechanism through which continuity is preserved. The Anunnaki stand at the center of this mechanism, not as heroes, but as administrators whose work allows the world to keep moving, reshaping humanity slowly, relentlessly, and without promise of rescue. The Sumerian texts never treat humanity as a temporary experiment destined for replacement or erasure. Even when destruction is described, even when populations are reduced and worlds are reset, humanity persists. This persistence is not framed as accidental. It is structured, reinforced, and repeatedly preserved through mechanisms that point toward survival as an intended outcome rather than an unintended remainder. What matters here is not survival in the sense of comfort or dominance, but survival as continuity. Humanity is not protected from hardship. it is preserved through it. The text consistently distinguish between eliminating a condition and eliminating a species. Conditions are altered, structures are dismantled, populations are reduced, but humanity itself remains. This distinction appears early and often. When the gods tire of a labour, humanity is created to assume it. This alone suggests intent beyond a short-term solution. A temporary workforce would not require shaping, it would require replacement. Instead, the text emphasizes refinement. Humanity is adjusted, limited and regulated rather than discarded. Even the most catastrophic events do not contradict this pattern. The flood does not erase humanity entirely, it compresses it. One lineage survives, carrying memory, seed, and continuity forward. This survival is not framed as rebellion against divine will, but as accommodation within it. The system allows humanity to continue, but under stricter conditions. The introduction of mortality after the flood is particularly revealing. Lifespans are shortened. Death becomes universal and unavoidable. At first glance, this appears punitive. In context, it functions as stabilization. Extended lifespans allowed accumulation beyond sustainable limits. Shortened lives force turnover. Turnover prevents stagnation and unchecked growth. Mortality then becomes a mechanism of survival at the species level. Individuals perish so that humanity can persist. The texts never mourn this transition, they accept it as necessary. This acceptance suggests an understanding that survival does not require individual perpetuity. The same logic applies to population controls. The texts describe measures that limit reproduction and increase vulnerability. Disease, infertility, and danger enter the world more prominently. These are not framed as cruelty. They are framed as corrections. Without them, population overwhelms resources. With them, balance becomes possible. The Anunnaki's involvement in these corrections reinforces the idea that survival is the priority. They do not seek to perfect humanity. They seek to keep it within survivable bounds. This implies expectation of continuation. There is no reason to regulate what one intends to erase. This expectation also appears in how knowledge is preserved. Writing emerges early and persists even through collapse. Archives are rebuilt, lists are recopied, rituals resume. Memory is treated as essential. A species not meant to survive would not require such investment in preservation. Cities, though they rise and fall, are rebuilt repeatedly. The location of Eridu matters even after its decline. Sacred geography persists beyond political relevance. This persistence indicates that continuity of human presence is assumed even when forms change. The texts also emphasize adaptability rather than purity. Humanity is not expected to remain unchanged. It is expected to adjust. Skills evolve, institutions shift, languages change. Survival is tied to flexibility, not preservation of original state. This adaptability is reinforced through fragmentation. No single catastrophe removes all knowledge. Loss is partial. What survives becomes the foundation for reconstruction. This pattern repeats across generations, teaching resilience through recurrence. The Anunnaki's judgments support this by targeting excess rather than existence. They respond to imbalance, not to humanity itself. Noise becomes intolerable. Population becomes too dense. Systems strain. Correction follows. Humanity remains. This distinction is subtle but consistent. The problem is never humanity's presence. It is humanity's scale or behaviour within the system. Survival is conditional, but the condition is alignment, not elimination. Even divine frustration does not escalate to total annihilation. The flood is the most extreme response, and even it preserves a remnant. Afterward, measures are put in place to prevent recurrence. This indicates learning at the system level. Humanity survives, and the system adjusts to support that survival. The The treatment of the survivor after the flood is also instructive. He is not returned to ordinary human life. He is removed, granted longevity, and placed beyond the cycle. This prevents the old world from dominating the new. Survival does not mean restoration of prior conditions. It means continuity under new rules. This separation preserves humanity's future by preventing dependence on figures tied to obsolete conditions. The survivor becomes a marker, not a leader. Humanity must proceed without guidance from the past. The text also suggests survival through delegation. As divine presence recedes, human institutions strengthen. Law replaces direct command. Ritual replaces conversation. Memory replaces instruction. These substitutions only make sense if humanity is expected to continue independently. The Anunnaki's role shifts accordingly. They remain as guarantors of consequence, not as managers of daily life. This allows humanity to operate autonomously within boundaries. Survival depends on self-regulation rather than constant oversight. The absence of prophecy reinforces this expectation. Humanity is not told what lies ahead because it must learn to handle whatever arrives. A species meant only to endure a limited period would be guided more closely. A species meant to persist must develop internal capacity. This internal capacity is built through repeated exposure to loss and rebuilding. Each cycle reinforces survival strategies. Storage, cooperation, hierarchy, and restraint become embedded behaviors. The texts do not romanticize this process. Survival is not portrayed as noble, it is portrayed as necessary. Humanity persists because the system requires maintenance, and humanity has become capable of providing it without destabilizing itself completely. The Anunnaki's continued presence in later myths underscores this expectation. They do not fade when humanity stabilizes. They remain because oversight remains necessary. Survival is ongoing, not achieved. The Sumerian worldview does not anticipate an end of history. There is no final catastrophe after which nothing continues. Even the flood is followed by renewal. This cyclical understanding implies expectation of continued human presence across repeated disruptions. Survival is therefore not a reward. It is a requirement. Humanity survives because the system depends on it functioning. When it functions poorly, correction occurs. When it functions within limits, continuity persists. This functional view avoids sentimental attachment. Humanity is not cherished for its uniqueness. It is valued for its role. This valuation supports survival by aligning human behavior with system needs rather than self-concept. The texts also suggest that survival is collective rather than individual. Individuals die, lineages continue, cities fall, culture persists. This collectivism reduces the impact of individual loss on overall continuity. The Anunnaki's judgments operate at this collective level. They do not punish individual sinners. They recalibrate populations and structures. This scale of intervention preserves species-level survival while accepting individual mortality. This acceptance is central. Humanity is not promised personal salvation. It is promised continuation as a whole. This promise is implicit, not declared. It is demonstrated through repeated preservation after collapse. The Sumerian texts never ask whether humanity deserves to survive. They assume survival as a given within constraints. The question is always how survival must change to remain viable. This framing removes moralization from catastrophe. Destruction is not retribution, it is adjustment. Survival is not forgiveness, it is necessity. The Anunnaki's role reinforces this neutrality. They do not express approval or condemnation, they administer outcomes. Their silence maintains focus on process rather than judgment. Preparation, viewed through this lens, is preparation for persistence. Humanity is shaped to endure cycles without destroying itself. Knowledge is fragmented, time is stretched, labor is enforced, silence is maintained. All of this supports long-term survival. The The system does not aim to perfect humanity. Perfection would be brittle. It aims to keep humanity adaptable. Adaptation is the core survival skill. As divine presence recedes further, humanity carries more responsibility. Survival depends increasingly on human institutions rather than divine intervention. This shift is gradual and deliberate. The Anunnaki remain as boundary keepers. They ensure that humanity does not exceed survivable limits as autonomy increases. Their presence allows the system to tolerate human error without total collapse. The texts do not promise that humanity will always succeed. They promise that humanity will always be tested. Survival is conditional, not guaranteed. But the system is structured to allow repeated attempts rather than final failure. This repeated allowance suggests intent. A system that repeatedly preserves a species after catastrophe signals expectation of its continuation. Humanity is meant to survive because the system is designed around that assumption. Survival, however, is not the end. It is the means by which preparation continues. Each generation inherits conditions shaped by prior corrections. Humanity learns incrementally, often painfully, to live within limits. The Anunnaki's judgments mark the edges of this learning. They close phases that have run their course. They allow new ones to begin. Humanity remains at the center of this cycle, not because it is exalted, but because it has proven capable of adapting enough to continue. The texts do not celebrate this capability. They document it. Survival is treated as a fact rather than a triumph. Humanity endures because it must, and because the system has been shaped to make that endurance possible under constraint. As the narrative continues, this expectation of survival will underlie every subsequent development. Knowledge will be lost and regained. Authority will shift. Memory will fracture and reform. Through all of this, humanity remains, not unchanged, not unscarred, but present. The Sumerian texts suggest that humanity was meant to survive, not because survival is a moral good, but because continuity is essential to the functioning of the world itself. Humanity becomes part of that function, shaped to endure within it, carrying forward a process that does not end but adjusts, generation after generation, without promise and without conclusion. The Sumerian texts quietly but consistently prepare humanity for a world in which divine presence becomes less immediate rather than more accessible. This preparation is not announced. It is not framed as loss. It unfolds gradually through distance, substitution, and restraint. The direction of movement is clear when the record is read as a whole. Humanity is not being trained to rely on gods who remain close. It is being shaped to function when those gods are increasingly absent. In the earliest layers of the tradition, interaction between gods and humans is more direct. Divine figures walk, speak, argue, and intervene openly. Over time, this immediacy fades. Speech becomes formalized. Communication shifts into ritual, omen, and dream. Eventually, even these channels grow opaque. The texts do not mark this change as decline. They treat it as progression. This progression aligns with a broader pattern of preparation already visible elsewhere. Dependence is reduced. Responsibility increases. Structures replace presence. Law replaces command. Memory replaces instruction. None of this is sudden. Sudden absence would destabilize the system. Gradual withdrawal allows adaptation. The Anunnaki play a central role in this transition. They do not compensate for absence by becoming more involved. They reinforce distance by remaining procedural and silent. Their authority does not depend on closeness. It depends on consequence. This allows divine presence to recede without eliminating accountability. Preparation for absence begins with the limitation of explanation. When gods no longer explain themselves, humans must infer patterns through experience. This inference strengthens autonomy. The world continues to operate even when meaning is unclear. Humanity learns that survival does not require constant guidance. Ritual becomes essential in this context. Ritual does not require presence. It requires repetition. It preserves alignment without dialogue. A ritual performed correctly does not depend on divine response. It depends on continuity. This makes ritual a perfect substitute for presence. Law serves a similar function. Law encodes expectations that once might have been enforced directly by gods. When divine speech fades, written law maintains order. It does not explain why rules exist. It states that they do. This mirrors divine silence rather than replacing it. The texts also show increasing emphasis on institutions rather than individuals. Temples persist even when priests change. Kingship persists even when kings fail. Cities endure even when dynasties collapse. These structures carry memory forward without requiring divine intervention. This institutionalization is not accidental. It is preparation for operating without immediate oversight. A world that depends on constant divine presence cannot scale. A world that embeds order into institutions can. The Anunnaki's judgments anchor this system. Even as gods withdraw from daily affairs, consequence remains reliable. Absence does not mean permissiveness. Boundaries still exist. When crossed, correction occurs. This consistency allows autonomy to expand without collapse. The underworld becomes increasingly significant in this context. It represents finality in a world where guidance is scarce. Entry into it does not require explanation. It marks the end of opportunity for adjustment. This finality gives weight to action in the absence of constant oversight. Preparation for absence also reshapes how humanity understands itself. Identity shifts from being defined by proximity to gods toward being defined by function within systems. Humans become maintainers of order rather than recipients of instruction. This shift reduces reliance on revelation. Knowledge becomes practical rather than absolute. What works persists. What fails is abandoned. Meaning emerges from outcome rather than decree. The flood narrative again provides a clear example. After the catastrophe, divine interaction does not intensify. It diminishes. New limits are imposed, but ongoing guidance does not follow. Humanity must navigate a harsher world with less direct support. This is not abandonment. It is expectation. The survivor's removal from ordinary human life reinforces this expectation. He does not become a perpetual intermediary. He exits the system. Humanity proceeds without him. The past does not guide the future directly. This separation ensures that humanity cannot rely indefinitely on figures tied to earlier conditions. Each generation must operate within its own constraints. Absence becomes normal. The texts also show that even gods are subject to absence. Some fade from prominence. Their cults decline. Their names persist only in lists. This divine disappearance mirrors human mortality. Nothing remains fully present forever. The Anunnaki's persistence amid this fading underscores their specific role. They remain because consequence must remain. Presence can fade. Accountability cannot. Preparation for absence also alters emotional orientation. Hope shifts away from divine rescue toward continuity of effort. Fear shifts away from punishment toward instability. Motivation becomes grounded in maintenance rather than reward. This grounding supports endurance. A population that expects rescue waits. A population that expects absence acts. The Sumerian system cultivates the latter. Silence supports this cultivation. Without constant reassurance, humans learn to tolerate uncertainty. Without explicit approval, they learn to act responsibly anyway. This internalization of responsibility is essential for long-term survival. The Anunnaki's silence reinforces this lesson. They do not reassure. They do not console. They enforce boundaries when necessary and remain otherwise distant. This distance encourages self-regulation. Preparation for absence also explains why the texts resist eschatology. There is no final return of the gods, no promised restoration of presence. The future is not framed as reunion, it is framed as continuation. This framing prevents nostalgia from dominating action. Longing for lost presence does not shape policy. Adaptation does. The system discourages fixation on what is gone. The gradual nature of withdrawal also prevents rebellion. Humanity adapts without recognizing a single moment of loss. Presence fades slowly enough to be replaced by habit and structure. The Anunnaki's administrative role remains stable through this shift. They do not become more distant because they were never close. Their authority does not change because it was never relational. This stability anchors the transition. Preparation for absence does not imply indifference to humanity's fate. It implies confidence in humanity's capacity to function within limits. The system does not abandon what it expects to persist. As divine presence recedes, human error becomes more consequential. There is less opportunity for correction through guidance. This increases the importance of memory, law, and institution. Preparation ensures these tools are in place before absence becomes pronounced. The texts never announce that the gods are leaving, they simply stop appearing. This lack of declaration prevents panic. Life continues uninterrupted. The Anunnaki's judgments continue to punctuate this continuity. They close faces cleanly, preventing unresolved tension from accumulating. This allows the system to move forward without reliance on presence. Preparation for absence also explains why humanity is never told what comes next. Absence demands flexibility. Certainty would constrain response. Ignorance preserves adaptability. This adaptability becomes humanity's defining trait, not knowledge, not favour, capacity to continue without assurance. The Sumerian worldview accepts that presence cannot scale across time. Absence is inevitable. Preparation ensures that absence does not equal collapse. The Anunnaki's role in this preparation is understated but decisive. They maintain consequence as presence fades. This continuity of consequence allows autonomy to grow without destabilizing the system. As the narrative continues, this absence will deepen. Divine figures will become more symbolic. Ritual will replace interaction. Interpretation will replace instruction. Humanity will carry more weight. Preparation for absence is therefore preparation for maturity within constraint. Humanity is not being readied for a return of the gods. It is being ready to function when that return never comes. This preparation is not framed as progress or decline. It is framed as necessity. A world that continues indefinitely cannot depend on constant intervention. It must embed order within itself. The Anunnaki ensure that this embedding holds. They do not fill the silence left by withdrawing presence. They preserve the boundaries that make silence survivable. Humanity learns, slowly and unevenly, to live without expectation of divine closeness. Work continues. Law persists. Memory endures. Life goes on. This continuation is the measure of success within the Sumerian system. Presence was never meant to be permanent. Absence was always coming. Preparation ensures that when absence arrives fully, it does not feel like an ending. It feels like the world continuing as it always has, demanding effort, adaptation, and restraint without explanation. The Anunnaki do not save humanity from absence. They ensure that absence does not dissolve into disorder. In doing so, they complete one of the most significant phases of preparation, shaping a species capable of existing within a world that no longer speaks back, but still responds to action with consequence. The withdrawal of divine oversight in the Sumerian texts is not marked by departure scenes, declarations, or moments of rupture. It unfolds quietly, almost imperceptibly, through shifts in responsibility, distance, and silence. Oversight does not vanish. It thins. What was once immediate becomes procedural. What was once spoken becomes inferred. This gradual change is one of the most important signals of preparation in the entire tradition. In the earliest narratives, divine involvement is close and frequent. Gods intervene directly in human affairs. They argue, complain, negotiate, and impose solutions. Problems are addressed through presence. When imbalance arises, gods respond in person. This closeness reflects a world still being stabilized, one that requires frequent correction to remain functional. Over time, this pattern changes. Intervention becomes less direct. Decisions are formalized. Councils replace conversation. Decrees replace dialogue. The system begins to rely less on constant attention and more on established structures. Oversight shifts from active management to conditional enforcement. This shift does not indicate loss of control. It indicates confidence in the system's capacity to function without constant adjustment. A system that cannot operate without supervision is not yet stable. The Sumerian worldview suggests that stability is achieved not when intervention ceases entirely, but when intervention becomes rare. Divine oversight withdraws first from daily affairs. Agriculture continues without divine instruction. Trade expands without divine negotiation. Law develops without divine authorship. Humans manage these domains themselves, guided by precedent rather than command. Oversight remains present only at the boundaries, where excess threatens collapse. The Anunnaki's role becomes clearer as this withdrawal progresses. They do not oversee daily operations. They do not monitor individual behavior. They remain associated with thresholds, outcomes, and finality. This makes them well suited to a system where oversight is limited, but consequence remains unavoidable. The texts show that as oversight withdraws, human institutions grow more complex. Kingship becomes formalized. Bureaucracy expands. Writing becomes central to administration. These developments are not portrayed as replacements for the gods. They are portrayed as necessary adaptations to reduce divine involvement. This adaptation requires discipline. Without constant correction, error accumulates. Oversight withdrawal therefore coincides with increased emphasis on law, ritual, and memory. These tools do not prevent error. They limit its spread. They allow correction to occur internally rather than through external intervention. The gods' reduced involvement also changes the emotional landscape of human experience. Fear of immediate punishment diminishes. Anxiety about long-term consequence increases. Humans begin to act with awareness that mistakes may not be corrected quickly, if at all. This awareness encourages caution and planning. The Sumerian texts reflect this change in tone. Early narratives are animated by divine presence. Later ones are more procedural. Lists replace stories. Records replace myths. This is not a decline in imagination. It is a shift in focus. The system becomes more concerned with continuity than explanation. Divine oversight withdraws unevenly. Some gods fade faster than others. Some domains retain closer association with divine figures longer. This unevenness prevents shock. Humanity adapts gradually, filling gaps with custom and institution as they appear. The Anunnaki remain relatively constant through this process. Their function does not require proximity. They are not relational gods. They do not offer guidance or comfort. Their authority persists because it operates at a structural level. They finalize outcomes regardless of presence. This persistence allows oversight to withdraw without eroding accountability. Humans may no longer hear the gods, but they still experience consequence. This continuity of consequence anchors behavior as presence fades. The underworld's increasing prominence in later texts reinforces this shift. Death becomes more definitive. Afterlife becomes less negotiable. The possibility of appeal diminishes. This finality compensates for reduced oversight in life. Knowing that outcomes cannot always be revised encourages restraint. The flood marks a significant point in this transition. After the catastrophe, divine involvement does not intensify to prevent recurrence. Instead, new limits are imposed and humanity is left to operate within them. Oversight becomes structural rather than reactive. This structural oversight relies on systems rather than intervention. Lifespan limits reduce accumulation. Mortality increases turnover. Scarcity enforces cooperation. These mechanisms regulate behavior without requiring divine presence. The survivor's removal from ordinary human life after the flood further emphasizes this shift. He does not become a permanent intermediary. He exits the system. Humanity continues without a living bridge to the old world. Oversight withdraws further. The texts do not frame this withdrawal as abandonment. They frame it as order taking root. A system that relies on constant oversight has not yet matured. Withdrawal indicates readiness for autonomy within constraint. This autonomy is not freedom in the modern sense. It is responsibility without reassurance. Humans must act without knowing whether actions are approved. Success and failure are determined by outcome rather than intent. The Anunnaki's judgments reinforce this outcome-based logic. They do not evaluate motives, they fix consequences. This consistency becomes more important as oversight withdraws. It provides a stable reference point in a world of increasing uncertainty. As divine oversight recedes, the role of interpretation grows. Omens become more ambiguous. Dreams require skilled readers. Signs multiply but clarify less. This ambiguity reflects reduced direct guidance. Humans must decide how to act based on partial information. This partial information is not a flaw. It is a training condition. Humans learn to weigh risk, to anticipate consequence without certainty. This skill becomes essential as divine presence continues to fade. The texts preserve this ambiguity deliberately. They do not resolve contradictions. They allow multiple interpretations to coexist. Oversight withdrawal thus coincides with pluralism of meaning. Pluralism reduces fragility. A system that depends on a single interpretation collapses when that interpretation fails. A system that tolerates variation adapts. Oversight withdrawal encourages this tolerance. The Anunnaki's authority remains intact within this pluralism because it does not depend on interpretation. Consequence does not vary with belief. This stabilizes behavior even as meaning diversifies. The withdrawal of oversight also affects how humanity relates to time. With fewer interventions, consequences unfold more slowly. Cause and effect stretch across generations. This temporal extension requires memory. Writing becomes essential. Archives replace divine memory. Records preserve precedent. Law references past cases rather than divine will. Oversight is replaced by continuity of documentation. This shift does not eliminate reverence. It changes its focus. Reverence moves from gods to order itself. Ritual continues, but it becomes formal rather than conversational. Precision replaces devotion. The Anunnaki silence fits this environment. They do not compete with human institutions for authority. They validate those institutions by enforcing consequences when they fail. The withdrawal of oversight also reshapes conflict. Without divine arbitration, disputes must be resolved through law and negotiation. Violence becomes more regulated. Punishment becomes standardized. These developments indicate increasing self-governance. Self-governance, however, remains bounded. When conflict exceeds manageable limits, correction occurs. Oversight may be distant, but it is not absent. The Anunnaki ensure that escalation does not become extinction. This balance between autonomy and enforcement is central to preparation. Humanity is not left alone entirely. It is allowed to operate until it threatens the system. Then boundaries reassert. The texts show that divine oversight withdraws most noticeably from innovation. New tools and techniques are developed without divine endorsement. Some succeed, others fail. Failure becomes instructive rather than corrected preemptively. This exposure to failure is deliberate. It trains humanity to evaluate outcomes rather than seek approval. Learning becomes experiential rather than guided. The The Anunnaki's judgments provide closure to failed experiments. They do not prevent experimentation, they contain its consequences. As oversight withdraws, humanity's relationship to uncertainty changes. Uncertainty becomes normal. Decisions are made with incomplete information. This condition persists indefinitely. The Sumerian worldview does not promise a return of oversight. There is no expectation that gods will become more present again. Withdrawal is directional, not cyclical. This direction aligns with preparation for absence. Humanity must become capable of sustaining order without constant intervention. Oversight withdraws to test this capacity. The texts do not celebrate this test, they record it. Suffering increases, mistakes multiply, but collapse is avoided. The Anunnaki's role becomes increasingly important as oversight thins. They are the last line of correction. Their judgments prevent irreversible breakdown. This prevention is quiet. It does not announce itself. Humanity often does not recognize it as intervention. Correction appears as disaster or decline rather than rescue. This ambiguity preserves autonomy. Humans respond to events without attributing them directly to divine action. Responsibility remains human. The withdrawal of oversight also reinforces humility. Humans cannot claim divine backing for their actions. Authority becomes provisional. Power must justify itself through results. The Sumerian texts reflect this humility by avoiding triumphant narratives. Success is temporary. Failure is expected. Continuity is the achievement. As oversight withdraws, preparation reaches a new phase. Humanity is no longer being guided closely. It is being monitored distantly. This monitoring ensures survival without stifling adaptation. The Anunnaki embody this monitoring. They are present enough to enforce boundaries, absent enough to allow growth. This balance allows the system to persist across long spans of time. Oversight withdrawal does not weaken the system. It strengthens it by reducing dependence. The texts never declare that oversight is fully withdrawn. They suggest a gradual process that may never complete entirely. Some presence remains, but it is minimal. This minimal presence is sufficient. Consequence does not require constant attention. It requires reliability. The Anunnaki provide that reliability. Their authority remains consistent even as other gods fade. This consistency anchors preparation. Humanity learns to live with less guidance, more responsibility, and enduring consequence. This learning is uneven, painful, and incomplete, but it continues. The withdrawal of divine oversight is not an end. It is a condition. A world prepared for absence must function within it. The Sumerian texts present this condition without commentary. They do not lament it. They do not celebrate it. They document its unfolding. Preparation through withdrawal ensures that humanity does not collapse when presence fades. It learns to rely on structures, memory, and restraint. The Anunnaki's role within this preparation is understated but decisive. They ensure that withdrawal does not become abandonment. Boundaries remain. Consequences persist. As the narrative continues, oversight will recede further. Human institutions will carry more weight. Error will become more costly. Adaptation will become more necessary. This progression does not conclude. It stabilizes. Humanity continues within a world that no longer speaks clearly but still responds. Divine oversight withdraws not to punish humanity, but to allow it to function independently within limits. Preparation for this condition has been ongoing since the beginning. The Anunnaki do not oppose this withdrawal. They enable it. Their administration allows presence to fade without disorder taking its place. In this way, withdrawal is not loss. It is transition. A system that has matured enough to endure without constant oversight continues, shaped by consequence rather than instruction, moving forward without promise, without explanation, and without finality. Memory occupies a unique position in the Sumerian worldview. It is not treated as a byproduct of experience or a passive record of what has passed. It is treated as a functional inheritance, something deliberately preserved as divine presence recedes. When oversight withdraws and instruction fades, memory remains, not as comfort, but as capability. The texts never describe the gods leaving humanity with a final revelation, a completed doctrine, or a comprehensive understanding of the world. What persists instead is remembrance. Names are recorded, events are listed, lineages are traced. Disasters are noted without embellishment. Survival is tied not to knowing everything, but to remembering enough. This emphasis becomes stronger as divine involvement diminishes. Early myths contain more direct interaction. Later records shift toward chronicles, king lists, laws, and administrative documents. These are not inspirational texts. They are repositories of memory. They preserve sequence, precedent, and consequence. Memory functions as a substitute for presence. Where gods once corrected imbalance directly, memory allows humans to anticipate imbalance indirectly. Past floods inform future planning. Previous collapses shape caution. Remembered failures restrain ambition more effectively than warnings ever could. The Anunnaki's role within this shift is subtle but essential. They do not deliver memory, they ensure its relevance. Consequence reinforces remembrance. When patterns repeat, memory gains authority. Forgetting becomes dangerous. Remembering becomes survival. The texts reflect this through repetition. Similar events recur with variation. Cities rise and fall. Kings overreach and are replaced. Each recurrence reinforces the same structural lessons without requiring explanation. Memory accumulates through pattern rather than narrative closure. Writing becomes the primary vessel for this memory, but it is not complete or unified. Tablets fragment. Archives are lost. Records contradict one another. This imperfection is not accidental. It mirrors the imperfect transmission of memory itself. Memory does not preserve everything. It preserves what persists long enough to matter. This selectivity shapes behaviour. What is remembered influences what is repeated. What is forgotten is often relearned through failure. The system tolerates this inefficiency because it produces durable adaptation. Lessons learned through loss endure longer than lessons learned through instruction. The Sumerian king list illustrates this clearly. It does not explain why kings fail. It records that they do. The implication is left unstated but unavoidable. Authority is temporary, power cycles. Memory enforces humility without preaching it. The Anunnaki's judgments give memory weight. A consequence that follows excess becomes a reference point. When a city collapses, it is remembered. When a population is reduced, the conditions leading to it are recalled. Memory becomes caution encoded in experience. This is why memory outlasts presence. Divine speech fades, but the effects of divine judgment remain embedded in history. Humanity does not need gods to explain limits, if limits have already been crossed and recorded. Ritual also serves memory. Repetition preserves form even when meaning shifts. A ritual performed without full understanding still carries the imprint of earlier conditions. It aligns behaviour with precedent rather than interpretation. Law functions similarly. Laws often outlive the circumstances that produced them. Their persistence preserves memory of past instability. Even when the original crisis is forgotten, the rule remains, shaping behaviour. The Anunnaki's silence supports this process. They do not refresh memory through constant reminder. They allow forgetting to occur until forgetting produces consequence. This reinforces the importance of remembrance organically. Memory also distributes responsibility across generations. One generation experiences collapse, the next inherits caution. This transfer reduces the need for constant intervention. The system relies on cumulative experience rather than immediate correction. The flood narrative again provides a clear example. The flood itself is not the gift. Memory of the flood is. That memory reshapes future behaviour. Lifespan limits, population controls and new rituals emerge not because gods remain present, but because memory demands adjustment. The survivor's removal from ordinary life ensures that memory does not become personified. Memory must reside in record and ritual, not in a living authority figure. This prevents stagnation. The past informs the future without ruling it directly. As divine presence recedes, memory becomes the primary mechanism through which preparation continues. Humanity is shaped by what it remembers rather than what it is told. This fosters independence within constraint. The Anunnaki's authority remains compatible with this shift because memory does not undermine consequence. Remembered boundaries still exist. When they're crossed, correction occurs. Memory reduces frequency of collapse, not possibility. This structure also tolerates loss of memory. Forgetting is expected. When memory erodes, cycles repeat. Collapse follows. Memory is relearned through consequence. The system resets without requiring divine explanation. This tolerance prevents brittleness. A system that depends on perfect memory would fail quickly. Imperfect memory produces resilience by allowing relearning. The cost is suffering. The benefit is endurance. The texts preserve this dynamic by avoiding final interpretations. They record events without resolving them. This openness allows memory to be reinterpreted as conditions change. What mattered in one era may matter differently in another. The Anunnaki do not standardize memory. They do not enforce a single narrative. They allow plurality as long as boundaries hold. This flexibility allows memory to adapt without losing function. Memory also shapes identity. Humanity defines itself through shared past rather than divine mandate. Culture emerges from accumulated experience. Tradition becomes authority. This authority is provisional. Traditions change. Laws are revised. Rituals evolve. Memory guides but does not dictate. This balance supports adaptation. The Sumerian worldview does not promise that memory will prevent all disaster. It promises that memory will make survival possible after disaster. This is a lower expectation, but a more reliable one. The Anunnaki's role ensures that memory remains relevant. Consequence keeps memory from becoming symbolic only. When forgotten limits are crossed, reality reasserts them. As oversight withdraws, memory carries increasing weight. Humanity becomes responsible for preserving and transmitting it. Writing expands, education formalizes, archives multiply. These developments reflect awareness that memory must replace presence. The texts do not present this as a gift wrapped in gratitude. It is simply what remains. Memory is not benevolent. It is necessary. Preparation through memory shapes a humanity capable of learning without guidance. Mistakes are costly, but not final. Collapse teaches what instruction never could. The Anunnaki's judgments punctuate this learning. They close chapters without explaining them. Memory fills the silence afterward. This silence is important. It forces reflection. It allows memory to settle. Immediate explanation would dull its impact. As the narrative continues, memory will remain the core inheritance. Knowledge will fragment. Presence will fade. Institutions will rise and fall. Through all of this, memory persists in altered forms. Humanity survives not because it is protected, but because it remembers enough to rebuild. When memory fails, the system allows relearning through consequence. This process never completes. Memory accumulates, erodes, and reforms. Each cycle adds texture. No final lesson is delivered. The Anunnaki do not preserve memory directly. They preserve the conditions under which memory matters. Their authority ensures that forgetting has cost and remembering has value. Memory becomes the final gift, not because it is generous, but because it is sufficient. A species capable of remembering consequences does not require constant supervision. As divine oversight withdraws further, memory becomes humanity's primary anchor. It ties present action to past outcome without requiring explanation. The system trusts memory more than instruction. Instruction fades, memory remains. This trust defines the final stage of preparation. Humanity is left not with answers, but with records, rituals, and scars. These shape behaviour more reliably than promises ever could. The Anunnaki's silence at this stage is complete. They do not remind, they do not warn, they respond when memory fails. This response is not corrective in the moment. It is formative across generations. Memory is renewed through loss and rebuilding. Preparation continues through this cycle, unannounced and unresolved. Memory carries forward what presence no longer provides. In this way, memory becomes the last enduring interface between humanity and the structure that shaped it, not as revelation, not as salvation, as accumulated consequence, preserved long enough to matter. The world continues. Humanity remembers, forgets, and remembers again. The system holds not because it speaks, but because memory remains, shaping action quietly within a world that no longer explains itself. If preparation was never completed, then the Sumerian texts are not describing a failed project, but an ongoing condition. Completion would imply a final state, a moment when humanity becomes fully ready, fully adjusted, fully aligned with the system that shaped it. The record does not support this idea. There is no point at which the gods declare the work finished. There is no era described as stable enough to require no further correction. Preparation appears not as a phase with an endpoint, but as a process designed to continue indefinitely. This has significant implications for how the role of the Anunnaki, humanity, and the world itself must be understood. A system built around completion would move toward resolution. A system built around continuity resists it. The Sumerian worldview consistently favours the latter. Cycles repeat. Corrections recur. Structures evolve and dissolve. Nothing settles permanently. If preparation were meant to be completed, one would expect a moment of handover, a transfer of authority, or a declaration of readiness. None of this appears. Even as divine oversight withdraws, consequence remains. Even as memory replaces instruction, limits persist. The absence of completion suggests that readiness is not a state to be achieved, but a capacity to be exercised repeatedly. This reframes humanity's condition. Humanity is not unfinished in the sense of being deficient. It is unfinished in the sense of being adaptable. A finished design would be rigid. Rigid systems break under changing conditions. An unfinished system can absorb shock. The Sumerian texts support this interpretation through their treatment of collapse. Collapse is not treated as evidence of failure. It is treated as a mechanism of adjustment. Cities fall, not because preparation failed, but because preparation includes loss as a corrective tool. Collapse trims excess. It redistributes population. It resets structures that have hardened beyond usefulness. If preparation were complete, collapse would be unnecessary. Stability would persist indefinitely. The fact that collapse remains a recurring feature indicates that preparation is not moving toward elimination of disruption, but toward survivability within it. The Anunnaki's continued relevance also supports this. If preparation had ended, administrative oversight would no longer be required. Boundaries would be internalized fully. Consequence would be self-regulating. The texts do not describe such a world. They describe one where oversight remains distant but active, intervening when thresholds are crossed. This suggests that humanity never reaches a point where it can be trusted entirely with unlimited autonomy. This is not condemnation. It is acknowledgement of scale. Human lifespans are short. Memory erodes, institutions drift, error accumulates. Preparation must therefore remain ongoing. The lack of completion also explains why knowledge remains fragmented. Wholeness of understanding would imply readiness. Fragmentation preserves caution. It prevents the illusion that humanity has mastered the system it inhabits. Mastery would invite overreach. Time reinforces this incompletion. Each generation inherits conditions shaped by previous adjustments. No generation begins from zero. No generation completes the work. Responsibility passes forward incomplete, demanding further adaptation. This intergenerational aspect is critical. Preparation that never completes ensures that learning remains distributed. No single cohort carries full authority. Wisdom accumulates unevenly, and loss remains possible. This instability is not a flaw. It prevents stagnation. The Sumerian worldview does not promise that humanity will ever outgrow the need for correction. It assumes that correction is part of existence. The question is not whether correction will occur, but whether it will be survivable. The Anunnaki's role aligns with this assumption. They do not aim to eliminate error, they aim to contain its consequences. This containment allows the system to persist even when mistakes recur. If preparation were complete, silence would end, explanation would arrive, absence would resolve into clarity. None of this happens. Silence persists. Absence deepens. Explanation remains partial. This persistence indicates that the system does not expect closure. The idea of an uncompleted preparation also reshapes how memory functions. Memory does not preserve a finished lesson. It preserves fragments of adaptation. Each remembered collapse teaches something, but not everything. Memory accumulates without resolving into certainty. This partiality keeps humanity responsive. Certainty would dull attention. Incompleteness keeps perception sharp. Humans continue to watch for signs, to interpret cycles, to adjust behavior. The Anunnaki's silence reinforces this condition. They do not confirm readiness. They do not announce failure. They respond only when limits are breached. This neutrality maintains tension without resolution. This tension is productive. It drives maintenance. It sustains effort. It prevents complacency. A completed preparation would invite rest. Rest would invite decay. The Sumerian texts consistently resist rest. Even after catastrophe, work resumes immediately. There is no period of divine reassurance, no declaration that the worst is over. Life continues because it must. If preparation were complete, one might expect an era of peace or abundance described as stable. Such an era does not appear. Prosperity is always temporary. Abundance precedes strain. Stability precedes collapse. This rhythm suggests that preparation is calibrated for fluctuation, not equilibrium. The Anunnaki administer these fluctuations. They close phases when continuation would be harmful. They do not prevent phases from emerging again. Excess returns. Correction returns. The cycle continues. This cycling implies that preparation is not linear. It does not move toward perfection. It oscillates within bounds. Humanity learns, forgets, relearns. This repetition is the preparation. The absence of completion also prevents eschatology. There is no final reckoning that resolves everything. The underworld is final for individuals, not for the system. History does not end. It adjusts. The Sumerian worldview does not frame this as pessimism. It frames it as realism. A world that continues indefinitely cannot aim for final states. It must aim for resilience. Humanity's role within this unfinished preparation is to remain adaptable, not to achieve mastery, but to avoid terminal failure. This is a lower expectation than enlightenment, but a more durable one. The Anunnaki's continued oversight ensures that failure remains partial. Even when humanity misjudges limits, correction occurs before extinction. This tolerance for error suggests expectation of repeated misjudgment. preparation that never completes allows for error without collapse. Completion would eliminate margin. A finished system has no room to adjust. The Sumerian texts preserve margin everywhere. Knowledge is incomplete. Authority is temporary. Memory erodes. Presence fades. These gaps create space for adaptation. If preparation were complete, these gaps would close. Certainty would replace ambiguity. Authority would stabilize. Memory would fix. The system would become brittle. The absence of completion, therefore, appears intentional. It maintains flexibility across timescales that exceed any single civilization. This interpretation also reframes humanity's perceived failures. Collapse is not evidence that preparation failed. It is evidence that preparation continues. Each collapse trims excess and reinforces boundary awareness. The Anunnaki's role is not to prevent collapse, but to ensure that collapse does not become terminal. This distinction is subtle but essential. The texts do not suggest that the gods are disappointed by incompletion. There is no language of regret. There is adjustment, not lamentation. This implies acceptance of ongoing preparation as sufficient. If preparation were meant to be completed, the gods would eventually withdraw entirely. Oversight would become unnecessary. The texts do not depict this outcome. Oversight becomes distant, not obsolete. This persistent oversight suggests that the system anticipates perpetual risk. Humanity remains capable of exceeding limits. Boundaries must therefore remain enforceable. The idea of unfinished preparation also explains why humanity is never told what it is being prepared for. Completion would require definition of an endpoint. Without completion, no endpoint exists. Preparation becomes general rather than specific. Humanity is shaped to handle unknowns rather than to meet a predetermined challenge. This generality is adaptive. It allows survival across unpredictable conditions. Specific preparation would fail when conditions change unexpectedly. The Sumerian texts favour this open-ended readiness. They do not narrow focus, they broaden capacity. The Anunnaki's silence supports this breadth. They do not specify goals, they enforce limits. This allows humanity to explore within a survivable range. If preparation were complete, exploration would become unnecessary. The system would settle. The texts do not describe settlement. They describe motion. This motion continues through divine withdrawal, memory accumulation, and institutionalization. Preparation shifts form but does not end. The final implication of unfinished preparation is that humanity is always provisional, not in value, but in form. Humanity is expected to change. Adaptation is ongoing. The Sumerian worldview does not promise that humanity will eventually become something final or perfected. It suggests that humanity will continue becoming, adjusting to conditions shaped by previous adjustments. The Anunnaki remain relevant because thresholds continue to be crossed. Their judgments continue to mark transitions. Preparation unfolds through these markers without closure. This lack of completion prevents despair. There is no final failure. There is no final success. There is continuation within constraint. The system does not judge humanity by outcome alone. It measures persistence. Humanity persists. That persistence is enough. If preparation was never completed, then it was never meant to be. Completion would end adaptation. Adaptation is the purpose. The Sumerian texts do not offer comfort in this. They offer structure. They show a world that continues despite uncertainty, loss, and incompletion. The Anunnaki's role within this world is to keep incompletion survivable. They do not finish the work. They ensure that it can continue. Preparation remains unfinished because the world remains in motion. As long as conditions change, preparation must adapt. There is no point at which readiness becomes permanent. This understanding reframes humanity's place within the cosmos. Humanity is not approaching a final state. It is maintaining position within a shifting system. The absence of completion is not a flaw. It is the condition that allows endurance across timescales that exceed comprehension. The texts preserve this condition without explanation. They do not justify incompletion. They document its operation. Preparation continues quietly, unannounced and unresolved. Humanity lives within it, shaped by limits, cycles, memory and consequence. The Anunnaki do not promise completion. They administer continuity. If preparation were completed, the story would end. It does not. It continues, as it always has, unfinished, adaptive and survivable, without resolution and without final instruction, within a world that does not require completion to persist. As this long movement slows, it does not resolve into an answer, because resolution was never part of the design. The Sumerian texts do not build toward revelation. They build toward endurance. What remains, when the layers are set gently one upon another, is not a destination but a condition. Preparation, in this worldview, is not aimed at an event waiting somewhere ahead in time. It is aimed at sustaining continuity in a world that does not pause, does not explain itself, and does not bend permanently to intention. When the question of preparation arises, it often carries modern expectations. Preparation is assumed to lead toward a moment of arrival, a trial, a return, or a confrontation. The Sumerian record resists this framing completely. Nothing in the texts points toward a singular future moment that would justify centuries of shaping, restraint, silence, and correction. Instead, everything points toward survival within uncertainty as the primary concern. Humanity is shaped to exist without guarantees. Knowledge is fragmented so that no single insight becomes absolute. Time is stretched so that consequences unfold slowly enough to teach without annihilating entirely. Labour is enforced so that order must be maintained continuously. Memory is preserved so that collapse leaves traces rather than voids. Divine presence withdraws so that responsibility shifts inward. Silence remains so that certainty never hardens into arrogance. Taken together, these elements do not prepare humanity for revelation. They prepare humanity for absence, not absence as emptiness, but absence as condition. A world in which meaning must be inferred rather than delivered. A world in which authority is provisional. A world in which continuation depends on restraint rather than triumph. The Anunnaki, when viewed through this lens, are not architects of a future event. They are custodians of thresholds. They appear not to announce what is coming, but to ensure that what has exceeded its limits does not carry forward unchanged. Their judgments do not propel history toward an endpoint. They trim history back into survivable form. Preparation, then, is not directional. It is stabilizing. Humanity is not being trained to ascend, transcend, or depart. It is being shaped to remain functional within a system that continues regardless of individual success or failure. This explains why the texts never express urgency. There is no countdown, no warning of imminent arrival, no sense that time is running out. Time is abundant even when lives are short. The system thinks in spans far longer than generations. Preparation unfolds at that scale. It also explains why suffering is not treated as disqualifying. Hardship does not mean preparation has failed. It means adjustment is occurring. The texts do not promise comfort. They promise continuity. When conditions become too comfortable, excess follows. Excess destabilizes. Correction restores viability. Humanity is prepared to endure correction without losing coherence. Cities fall, but culture persists. Knowledge is lost, but memory remains. Authority collapses, but structure reforms. This persistence is not accidental. It is the product of long shaping. If preparation had been for a final event, the record would narrow toward it. Instead, the record widens. It accommodates contradiction. It tolerates loss. It absorbs change. This widening suggests that preparation is meant to support adaptation across unknown futures rather than readiness for a known one. The Anunnaki's silence at the end of the record reinforces this. They do not clarify, they do not conclude. They remain associated with consequence, not explanation. Their continued relevance suggests that thresholds will continue to be crossed. Adjustment will continue to be necessary. Humanity's role within this unfinished preparation is not passive. Humans build, forget, rebuild, reinterpret, and adapt. Mistakes recur. Excess returns. Memory erodes and reforms. Each cycle adds texture rather than closure. Preparation without completion allows this texture to accumulate. A finished preparation would produce rigidity. Rigidity would fail under changing conditions. Incompletion preserves flexibility. The Sumerian worldview does not require humanity to know what it is being prepared for. Knowing would narrow response. Not knowing keeps response broad. A species prepared for uncertainty can endure many forms of disruption. A species prepared for a single outcome cannot. This breadth of readiness explains why the texts avoid prophecy. Prophecy fixes attention on a future that may never arrive. The Sumerian system fixes attention on maintaining balance now, adjusting when balance is lost, and preserving enough memory to recover when collapse occurs. The Anunnaki do not contradict this focus. They reinforce it. Their judgments do not point forward. They close what must end so that continuation remains possible. They are not heralds of destiny. They are maintainers of survivability. If preparation has no endpoint, then it also has no final failure. Collapse is not terminal. Loss is not absolute. Even extinction-level threats are framed in ways that preserve some continuity. This tolerance for failure without annihilation is a defining feature of the system. Humanity is not being prepared to escape the world. It is being prepared to remain within it under changing conditions, carrying forward enough structure to prevent dissolution into chaos. This understanding shifts the tone of the entire record. What might otherwise appear bleak becomes pragmatic. What might seem harsh becomes stabilizing. The system does not ask humanity to be perfect. It asks humanity not to exceed what it can sustain. The Anunnaki's distance supports this pragmatism. They do not offer comfort because comfort is not reliable. They offer consequence because consequence teaches. Their silence allows humanity to develop internal reference points rather than dependence. As divine presence recedes, human responsibility expands. This expansion is not sudden. It is gradual, uneven, and often painful. But it continues because it must. A world that lasts longer than any generation cannot rely on constant supervision. Preparation, in this sense, is preparation for continuity without guidance. Humanity is shaped to function within limits that are not fully explained, to act without assurance, and to recover without instruction. This is why memory becomes so important. Memory does not tell humanity where it is going. It tells humanity what has happened before. That is enough to shape behavior. That is enough to preserve survivability. The final shape of preparation is therefore not readiness for an event, but capacity to continue without clarity. Humanity becomes capable of living within silence, absence, and uncertainty without unraveling completely. The Sumerian texts do not frame this as achievement. They frame it as condition. The world continues. Humanity persists. Oversight remains distant but present enough to enforce boundaries. Nothing here resolves. Nothing concludes. The system does not close its books. Preparation does not end. It shifts form as conditions change. The Anunnaki remain as figures of closure rather than promise. They do not announce futures. They mark limits. Their work ensures that when forms become unsustainable, they end cleanly enough for something else to follow. If there is a quiet thought to be carried forward, it is not an answer but an orientation. Humanity is shaped not for certainty, not for rescue, and not for completion. Humanity is shaped for endurance within a world that continues to move, adjust, and repeat without explanation. The preparation was not aimed at a moment waiting somewhere ahead. It was aimed at making sure that whatever comes, however it arrives, does not end everything. The system does not reveal what lies beyond the next threshold. It ensures that there will be something beyond it, and so the movement slows without stopping. The world remains, humanity remains. Preparation continues quietly, not as a promise fulfilled, but as a condition maintained. Nothing more needs to be said. The silence that follows is not empty. It is the space in which continuation happens, unannounced, unresolved, and still intact.